The stretcher hit the ER doors so hard one of the hinges bent sideways. The man on it had no wallet, no ID, no explanation for the 7-inch wound track running beneath his left clavicle. The kind of wound that didn't come from glass or metal or anything a highway produced. Every doctor in the building ran toward the noise, toward the obvious, toward the 18 other victims bleeding loudly across the admissions floor. Nurse Mara Voss walked the other direction. She walked toward this quiet one, the man nobody was watching, and when she crouched beside him, when his eyes opened for exactly 3 seconds, he said one word. One word that should have been impossible for a stranger to know, the word she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 7 years. Warden. Her old call sign. If this story already has you leaning forward, follow my channel right now, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go. The morning had started the way most mornings started at Hargrove General Hospital in Denton Falls, Oregon, with Dr. Elliot Cass making someone feel small before he'd finished his first coffee. Today it was Mara. It was almost always Mara. She was charting at the nurse's station when he appeared beside her, not quite looking at her, the way people look slightly past a piece of furniture they've learned to navigate around. Donovan's fluids are running at the wrong rate, he said. The order was changed at 6:40, Mara answered without looking up. Dr. Nguyen adjusted it after the morning labs came back. I updated the chart. A pause. The patient's name is Donovan, she added. Room 11. Cass picked up the chart, scanned it, set it back down. He didn't say she was right. He didn't say anything. He just walked away, and the 2 residents trailing behind him walked away too, and the interaction was over the same way all those interactions were over, with Mara still standing at the counter and the room slightly colder than it had been before he entered. She was used to it. 7 years in civilian nursing had given her a high tolerance for being underestimated by people who believed their credentials entitled them to a particular kind of deference. She'd learned early that the fastest way to survive in a hospital like Hargrove General, busy, underfunded, structured around a rigid hierarchy that rewarded volume over precision, was to be accurate, quiet, and absolutely unshakable when it mattered. She had the first 2 down without effort. The third one she'd learned somewhere else entirely. Mara Voss, age 38, had been a U.S. Army major for 11 years before she wasn't. Before she signed the papers, packed a single bag, and disappeared into the ordinary world with a nursing license she'd earned during her 3rd deployment and a story she'd carefully never told anyone. Her file was classified enough that even the people who'd worked beside her for the last 4 years at Hargrove General knew almost nothing about where she'd come from. They knew she was a good nurse. They knew she was hard to rattle. They knew she sometimes caught things the attending missed, which made certain attendings visibly annoyed with her. They knew she preferred the overnight shifts when the floor ran quieter and the patients got more of her actual attention. That was the sum of what they knew. The rest of it, the 11 years, the unit designations that didn't appear in any public record, the call sign she'd stopped answering to, stayed packed away in the same internal compartment she'd built for it and hadn't opened since, until that afternoon. The mass casualty call came in at 2:17 p.m., 18-vehicle pileup on Route 9, 40 minutes east of Denton Falls. A tanker truck had crossed the median, and the chain reaction had taken out a school van, 3 sedans, a construction hauler, and everything else unlucky enough to be in that stretch of road during the early afternoon run. Hargrove General activated its trauma protocol at 2:23. By 2:40, the first ambulances were coming through. Mara was already suited and staged in Trauma Bay 2 when they started rolling in. The floor erupted into the particular organized chaos that mass casualty events produced. Controlled noise, fast feet, competing radio calls, everyone moving with purpose, but not enough space to move comfortably. She worked 3 patients in the first 40 minutes. A teenager with a shattered forearm and glass embedded above her right eye. A man in his 50s with suspected internal bleeding who stabilized faster than expected once they got fluids into him. A woman in her 30s who kept asking about her dog in a voice so calm it indicated shock rather than composure. Then the doors hit. The stretcher came through hard enough to dent the doorstop, pushed by 2 paramedics who were already calling out stats before they'd fully cleared the threshold. Male, approximately 40 to 45, unrestrained, found 30 meters from the primary impact zone. Vitals? Mara called out. BP 90 over palp, pulse 110, breathing's compromised on the left side. She was already moving. The man on the stretcher was large, broad-shouldered, the kind of build that suggested serious physical conditioning even now, when he was unconscious and gray at the lips. His clothing was wrong for a civilian driver. The jacket was tactical fabric, not commercial. The boots were worn in a particular pattern she recognized from people who spent long hours in load-bearing gear. There was a laceration along his jaw that was clean at the edges, in a way that blunt force trauma from a vehicle accident didn't produce. She clocked all of it in about 4 seconds. Everyone else was busy. 3 attendings had converged on the trauma bay's primary table, working a pediatric patient who was coding. 2 more were managing a double amputation in Bay 1. The resident assigned to overflow was already stretched across 2 other patients and throwing her a look that said, "I'll get there when I get there." Mara moved to the man's bedside. He was breathing, barely. Left chest was moving wrong. Asymmetrical excursion, breath sounds absent on that side when she pressed a stethoscope to him. She palpated his neck. No tracheal shift yet, but the subtle rightward pull was starting. This wasn't a car accident injury. She'd seen this pattern before. Blunt thoracic trauma from a direct impact. Not a dashboard, not a seatbelt, something applied with deliberate force to a specific region. She'd treated this in a field hospital outside a city she wasn't allowed to name in polite company. She'd seen it done to people on purpose. She straightened up and looked around the room for a physician. "So, I need an attending over here." No response. "I need an attending at overflow 4. Still nothing. The pediatric code was consuming everyone with a pulse and a medical degree. She looked back at the man on the stretcher. Then his hand moved. It was a small movement, barely voluntary, just his right hand sliding a few inches across the mattress in her direction. She put her fingers against his wrist to check his pulse, and his grip tightened. Not frantic, not grabbing, just deliberate. A soldier's grip, the kind that meant, "I know you're there, don't leave." His eyes opened. 3 seconds. Maybe less. He looked directly at her, and something moved across his face. Recognition, or the closest thing to it that a man in his condition could manage. "Warden," he said. One word, barely a word, more like the shape of one, pushed through insufficient air. Then his eyes closed, and his grip went slack, and his blood pressure alarm started screaming. Mara stood very still for exactly 2 seconds. Then she moved faster than she'd moved in years. "I need a portable chest x-ray at overflow 4, right now." She was already pulling the crash cart closer, rechecking his airway. "And someone get me an ultrasound." "We don't have a portable free," a tech called from across the room. "Find one." "Nurse Voss," Dr. Cass's voice cut across the floor. He was moving toward her from the direction of the supply corridor, mask around his neck, tablet in hand. "What are you doing?" "Suspected tension pneumothorax, possible hemothorax. He needs imaging immediately." Cass glanced at the patient with the particular look he reserved for situations where someone else had initiated a clinical decision before he had. "He's in the overflow queue. I'll evaluate when I have a moment." "He doesn't have a moment. That's not your determination to make." She turned to face him fully. His breath sounds are absent on the left. His pressure is dropping. The deviation is starting. If this is a tension pneumo and we wait, "I'm aware of what tension pneumothorax is," Cass said, clipping each word. "What I'm telling you is that we have a pediatric patient actively coding 3 feet away, and you do not have the authority to redirect imaging resources based on your personal assessment. Then get someone over here who does. I will evaluate this patient when I'm available. He'll be dead in 8 minutes." The words landed flat. Not dramatic, just factual, the way she'd learned to say things when there was no time for softening. Cass stared at her. "Stand down, Nurse Voss." She didn't stand down. She turned to the tech nearest her. "Portable ultrasound. Now. I'll sign for it." Tub. What the ultrasound showed took 30 seconds to interpret and no medical degree to understand if you were looking at the right thing. A catastrophic collection of blood in the left pleural space. Not a small bleed, not something that would stabilize on its own. The kind of hemothorax that killed people in the time it took to make the wrong decision, twice. She printed the image, She walked it across the room and held it in front of Dr. Cass. He looked at it for a long moment. Something shifted in his face, not apology, not acknowledgement of what had just happened, but the clinical recalibration of a man who recognized that the situation had changed and that he needed to act. "Get me a thoracic surgeon on the line," he said to the room. The surgery took 2 hours and 11 minutes. The man survived. The official complaint was filed before the end of Mara's shift. She was in the break room, still in her scrubs, when Tanya Briggs from Nursing Administration appeared in the doorway with a tablet and an expression that communicated institutional discomfort. "Mara, do you have a few minutes?" She did not have a few minutes. She had approximately 1 cup of coffee's worth of energy left and 3 more hours on her shift. But she followed Tanya down the hallway to the small administrative office near the elevators, and she sat in the chair across from the desk, and she listened. The framing was careful. Insubordination wasn't the word Tanya used directly. She used protocol deviation and unilateral resource allocation and concern from senior medical staff. But the shape of it was the same. Mara had overridden a physician's instruction. Mara had directed a technician to act outside the established chain of command. Mara had created a disruptive dynamic in the middle of a mass casualty event. "The patient survived," Mara said. "That's not in dispute. He survived because of the imaging." "Mara," Tanya set the tablet down, "I understand what you believe happened, but Dr. Cass has significant concerns about how you handled this situation, and those concerns have been escalated to Director Aldridge. Until this is reviewed, we're asking you to step back from direct patient care." Mara looked at her for a moment. "You're suspending me. We're asking you to step back while the review occurs. It's temporary." "A man would be dead." Tanya didn't answer. "If I had stood where Dr. Cass told me to stand, a man would be dead right now." Mara's voice was level, not raised, not bitter, just clear. "I want that in the record. You can submit a statement during the review process." Mara nodded once. She stood. She picked up her bag. "Tanya," she said at the door, "whatever's in that chart, whatever that patient said when they brought him in, make sure it's secured." Tanya looked confused. "Pardon?" But Mara had already turned toward the elevator. She changed in the locker room, trading scrubs for jeans and a gray jacket, and she was 3 steps from the hospital's side exit when she became aware of 2 things simultaneously. The first was that the man in the corner of the lobby, the one reading a newspaper, sitting in the chair angled toward the elevator bank, was not reading the newspaper. His eyes hadn't moved in the last 40 seconds. His posture was too deliberate. He was watching the exits. The second was that a woman in a dark blazer had just appeared from the direction of the administrative wing and was moving toward Mara with the particular kind of unhurried certainty that meant she knew exactly where Mara was going to be. Mara stopped walking. The woman stopped 2 feet away. She was in her mid-40s, dark hair cut short, and she had the look of someone who had spent a significant portion of her career in rooms where everything said was off the record. She held out a badge in a leather case. Not a hospital ID, not local law enforcement, Defense Intelligence. "Ms. Voss," she said, "my name is Sinclair. I'd like to speak with you somewhere private." Mara looked at the badge, looked at the woman, looked at the man with the newspaper, who had very carefully not looked up. "The patient in Overflow 4, Mara said. "Yes." "He's one of yours." The woman named Sinclair put the badge away. "He's one of ours," she confirmed. And the accident that brought him here wasn't an accident. The lobby noise continued around them. The ordinary churn of a hospital afternoon, families coming and going, the elevator chiming, a child somewhere crying with the particular intensity of someone who had been waiting too long. Ordinary sounds, ordinary world. Mara looked at the exit she'd been 3 steps from reaching. Then she looked back at Sinclair. "How compromised is this building?" she asked. Something moved behind Sinclair's eyes. Not surprise, exactly. More like the confirmation of an assessment she'd already made. "That," Sinclair said quietly, "is exactly the right question." They used a family consultation room on the 2nd floor, the kind with soft chairs and a box of tissues on a side table, the kind designed to absorb bad news. Sinclair's colleague, a man she introduced only as Reyes, pulled the blinds and stood near the door. Outside, through the narrow gap at the window's edge, the afternoon light was going orange and thin. Sinclair set a single photograph on the table between them. The man from Overflow 4. Younger in the photo, sharper, wearing field gear in a location that had been digitally scrubbed to remove any identifiable background. But his face was clear. His name is Thomas Greer, Sinclair said. He's been embedded in a surveillance operation for the last 14 months. 3 days ago, his cover was flagged as compromised. This morning, he was supposed to extract. Instead, someone redirected his route, and a semi-truck crossed a median at highway speed into his vehicle. Someone knew his extraction route, Mara said. Yes, and they knew it recently enough to intercept it. Within the last 72 hours, which means the breach is close. Sinclair folded her hands on the table. Greer was brought here because this was the nearest trauma center, but someone made a call. Within 20 minutes of his arrival, we picked up communication activity from inside this facility, encrypted, sent to an external source we've been tracking for months. Mara was quiet for a moment. She was turning it over the way she used to turn intelligence over, looking for the edges, the joins, the places where the structure revealed itself. He said my call sign, she said. He knew who you were before this morning. Your reassignment to Hargrove General is in a file that was accessed recently by someone who shouldn't have had clearance for it. Sinclair's voice was neutral. We believe Greer made you when they brought him in. We believe it kept him alive long enough to hold on until the surgery. Mara looked at the photograph for another moment. She thought about the word he'd said, the way he'd said it, not like he was asking for her, not like a name, but like a confirmation. You're here. Someone is here who will know what to do. Who else in this hospital knows I'm prior service? She asked. As of this morning, Sinclair said, we don't believe anyone. And now? Sinclair looked at her steadily. That depends on who made the call. The room was quiet. Outside the door, the hospital moved through its afternoon. PA announcements, the sound of a cart in the corridor, the particular ventilation hum that every large building had, the white noise of an institution that didn't know it was being watched. What do you need from me? Mara asked. For the next 24 hours, we need you to act exactly as you would have acted if this conversation hadn't happened. Go back to your floor. Accept whatever administrative decision comes down. Don't signal anything to anyone. They're pushing me out of clinical rotation. We know. Let them. Mara looked at the table, then at Sinclair. And Greer? He's in surgical recovery. He's stable. A pause. He's also the only person who can name the individuals inside the network he was surveilling, which means whoever sent that communication this morning knows they didn't finish the job. The sentence landed with the weight Sinclair intended it to carry. Mara had spent 7 years putting distance between herself and rooms exactly like this one. Rooms where the stakes were described in plain language because there wasn't time to soften them. Rooms where someone laid a photograph on a table and waited for you to decide whether you were in or out. She thought she was done with those rooms. The communication, she said. The one sent from inside the hospital. Do you know where it originated? Sinclair reached into her jacket and placed a small printed page on the table. A floor map. One area highlighted in yellow. Mara looked at it. The highlighted section was the administrative wing, director's office suite. She thought about Tanya Briggs with her careful language and her tablet and her concern from senior medical staff. She thought about how quickly the complaint had been filed, how efficiently she'd been moved out of the clinical space and into a conversation designed to make her feel like the problem. How useful it would be, she realized, to have a decorated trauma nurse suspended and discredited before she had a chance to talk to anyone. 24 hours, Mara said. Possibly less, Sinclair said. Mara nodded once. She stood. She straightened her jacket. She picked up her bag. At the door, she paused with her hand on the frame. There was something else. Something Sinclair hadn't said and that Mara hadn't asked directly, because she'd learned a long time ago that some questions were better left in the space between people, where they could be acknowledged without being spoken. Thomas Greer had known her call sign. Her call sign was not in any file a defense intelligence officer should have been able to access easily. It was in a classified operational record that dated back to a unit that had officially never existed, which meant Greer wasn't just an operative who'd happened to end up at Hargrove General. He'd known she was here. He'd come here. She didn't say any of that. She just stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to the hospital breathe around her. All that ordinary noise, All those ordinary lives moving through their ordinary afternoon. And she thought about the 7 years she'd spent trying to believe that ordinary was something she could become. Then she let go of the door frame and walked back into the corridor. Behind her, Sinclair watched her go. Reyes, still at the window, spoke quietly without turning around. "She's already running it." "Yes," Sinclair said. "Is she going to hold for 24 hours? Sinclair considered the question. She thought about the way Mara Voss had looked at the floor map. Not surprised, not alarmed, just absorbing it the way someone absorbed information they had been, on some level, already expecting. "She's going to do whatever's necessary," Sinclair said. It wasn't quite an answer, but in this kind of work, it was the best one available. Cool. At 6:44 p.m., Thomas Greer's post-surgical chart was accessed from a terminal in the administrative wing. The access was logged. The log was automatically flagged by a monitoring system that had been quietly installed on Hargrove General's network 17 hours before Greer arrived. At 6:51 p.m., a second access attempt was made, this time to the admissions record for the mass casualty event, specifically the overflow intake documentation. At 6:58 p.m., Mara's personnel file was opened from the same terminal. None of this was visible to anyone inside the hospital. But in a white van parked in the hospital's service lot, a technician watching 3 screens simultaneously circled the terminal's ID number, picked up a secure radio, and made a quiet call. And in room 214 of the surgical recovery ward, Thomas Greer lay with a chest tube and an IV and the slightly elevated alertness of a man who wasn't sleeping nearly as deeply as his vitals chart suggested. The door to his room was closed. The window above his bed looked out over the service entrance. At 7:03 p.m., a maintenance crew arrived at the service entrance and began loading equipment through the side bay. Greer watched the crew. He watched the second man from the right, the one who moved wrong, who kept his head angled slightly down in a way that positioned the brim of his cap to block the angle of the security camera above the bay door. Greer's hand moved slowly toward the call button on his bed rail. He pressed it once. Then he pressed it in the specific pattern. 2 short, 1 long, 2 short. That meant something very different from "I need a nurse." Down the corridor, the monitoring station registered the call. The nurse assigned to the station looked at it, frowned slightly, and reached for her radio. Mara Voss, who was supposed to be heading to the parking structure, was instead standing at the end of the second-floor corridor, bag still over her shoulder, watching the door to room 214 from 50 feet away. She heard the radio crackle. She didn't move toward the room. She moved toward the window at the end of the corridor instead, the one that looked down over the service entrance. She counted the crew. She counted again. The second man from the right was gone. Her hand was already in her jacket pocket, where a small radio Sinclair had pressed into her palm during the handshake at the end of their meeting was currently set to a frequency that looked like dead air unless you knew otherwise. She pressed the transmit button. "Second floor," she said. "Service entry. 1 unaccounted for. He's already inside." 3 seconds of silence. Then Sinclair's voice, flat and immediate. "Lockdown 214. We're moving." Mara was already moving too. Not toward the stairs, toward room 214, because 24 hours was apparently not how long they had. The corridor was 40 feet long and Mara covered it in seconds. Not running. Running draws eyes. Running gets remembered. But moving with the compressed efficiency of someone who had once crossed open ground under conditions that made a hospital hallway feel like a Sunday walk. Room 214 was third from the end. The door was still closed. She didn't knock. She pushed it open with her shoulder, already reading the room as she crossed the threshold. Greer in the bed, chest tube in place, IV line intact, monitors registering. And the bathroom door on the left side, which was 6 inches ajar when it should have been flush. She registered all of it in under 2 seconds. "Greer," she said, "can you move?" "Can." His eyes were open. Alert in a way that had nothing to do with post-surgical recovery and everything to do with whatever had kept him functional long enough to press that call pattern. "Not fast," he said. His voice was rough, stripped down by the tube that had been in his throat 3 hours ago. "Left side's garbage." "I know." She moved to the bathroom door, put her back to the wall beside it, listened. Nothing. Then a very small sound. The specific creak of a man shifting his weight, trying to redistribute pressure quietly, which was exactly the wrong thing to do on a tile floor when someone on the other side was paying attention. She pulled the door open fast. The man inside was already moving. He had a syringe in his right hand, uncapped, held with the practiced grip of someone who had done this before. And he came through the doorway with the kind of controlled violence that told her he had military training, which meant the next 4 seconds were going to be genuinely unpleasant. She stepped into him instead of back. It was the one move he hadn't prepared for. People moved away from a syringe. That was the instinct. That was what training built in. And his forward momentum carried him into her shoulder, which he drove up into his chin with enough force that his head snapped back and his grip on the syringe broke. She took his wrist, turned it, felt the joint give, and the syringe hit the tile. He recovered faster than she expected, a knee to her thigh that would leave a bruise the size of her palm. But she already had his arm in a lock that he was going to have to dislocate his own shoulder to escape from, and she held it there, face to the wall, and she breathed. The whole thing had taken 9 seconds. "Don't," she said when he tried to shift his weight. She increased the pressure on the lock by about 15%. He stopped moving. The door to 214 banged open, and Reyes came through with 2 other people behind him, and it was over. But they cuffed the man and moved him out of the room in under 3 minutes. Reyes threw a glance at Mara's leg. She was favoring the left side slightly, the knee impact already stiffening, and she shook her head because there was no time for that conversation. Sinclair appeared in the doorway. She looked at the tile where the syringe had landed, at Mara, at Greer in the bed. "You were supposed to hold position," she said. "He was already in the building," Mara said. "You were 2 minutes out. We were 90 seconds out." He had a syringe to a man with a chest tube. Mara picked up the syringe from the floor with a gloved hand she'd pulled from the supply cart near the door. "What's in this?" Sinclair took it carefully. Her expression didn't change, but something tightened around her eyes. "We'll know in an hour." Greer made a sound from the bed, not quite a laugh, not quite a cough. "Potassium," he said. "That's their method. Clean, fast, reads like a cardiac event on a post-surgical patient." The room was quiet for a moment. "Who sent him?" Mara asked. Greer looked at her. "The same people who routed my extraction." "Inside the hospital?" "Inside the hospital," he confirmed, "and above it." Sinclair pulled Mara out of the room while Reyes coordinated with 2 additional agents who had materialized from somewhere in the building. They had the look of people who had been positioned here before any of this started, which meant the operation had been larger than Sinclair had outlined in the consultation room, which meant Mara had been given a partial picture. She'd expected that. She said as much. Sinclair didn't apologize. "We couldn't read you in fully until we knew whether you were still operational. I'm a hospital nurse. You were a major with 11 years in a unit that doesn't appear in any public record, and you just put a trained operative face down on a tile floor in 9 seconds. Sinclair's voice was even. "So, are you still operational?" Mara looked down the corridor. The monitoring station was empty. The nurse who'd been there had been quietly redirected, she assumed, part of the controlled perimeter that Sinclair's people had established without the hospital's knowledge. The evening shift was in transition. The floor was between its 2 busiest periods, that narrow window when staff attention was distributed thin. Someone had timed this. "The access to Greer's chart," Mara said. "The terminal in the administrative wing. Director's suite," Sinclair said. "We know. Have you moved on it?" "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because the director isn't the top of it," Sinclair said. "She's a node. We move on her now, the network severs, and the people above her disappear. We need her communicating for another 12 hours while we trace the chain." Mara thought about Catherine Aldridge, Director Aldridge, who had been running Hargrove General for 6 years, who had built a reputation as a pragmatic administrator, who had reportedly come from a healthcare management background before transitioning into hospital leadership. She thought about the speed of the complaint that had been filed against her, how it had moved through channels that usually took days in under 3 hours, how useful it was to have a disruptive nurse pushed out of clinical access before investigators arrived. "She knew I was prior service," Mara said. Sinclair's expression shifted very slightly. "What makes you say that?" "Because the complaint was filed to isolate me, not discipline me. If this were about protocol, they'd have flagged it for a standard review and let me keep working. Instead, they pulled me from the floor immediately." She paused. Someone told her to contain me specifically, which means someone told her who I was. The file access, Sinclair said. 3 days ago. Someone pulled your record and told her. Probably. Mara was quiet for a moment. Down the corridor, 2 of Sinclair's people were moving with the unhurried deliberateness of hospital staff, blending into the shift change traffic. Good tradecraft. She'd used the same approach herself in different settings. What do you need me to do? She asked. Right now, go home. Let the suspension stand. Don't contact anyone from this hospital. Sinclair paused. And don't go anywhere alone. You think there are more of them? The man in Greer's bathroom made a call before he entered the building. We intercepted it, but couldn't fully decrypt in time. Sinclair's voice carried no particular inflection, which was itself a kind of answer. We don't know who else inside this facility is involved. Mara thought about the floor she'd worked for 4 years. The people she knew by name, by habit, by the particular shorthand that developed between coworkers who spent 12-hour shifts in a high-pressure environment. She thought about who had access to the administrative wing after hours, who knew the shift change windows, who could have provided the information about Greer's chart location and room assignment within 20 minutes of his arrival. The list of people who could have done all of that was not long. Tanya Briggs, she said. Sinclair looked at her. Administration. She was the one who delivered the suspension. She had the tablet already prepared when she came to find me, which means the decision had been made before she walked through that door. Mara kept her voice low and even. And she asked me to make sure Greer's chart was secured. Her words, not mine. Which is not something a nursing administrator would know to ask unless someone told her his chart was significant. We're aware of Briggs, Sinclair said, which meant they'd already flagged her. Which meant Mara had just independently confirmed something they suspected, which was the kind of corroboration that mattered in an investigation. Go home, Ms. Voss, Sinclair said. We'll be in contact before morning. She didn't go home. She went to her car, sat in it for 11 minutes in the parking structure, and thought. The knee was stiffening up properly now. She'd have a bruise by morning, deep tissue, the kind that ached when the weather changed. She'd had worse. She pressed her fingers against it, assessed the damage with the same clinical detachment she used on patients, decided it was a bruise and not a structural problem, and moved on. What she kept returning to was the syringe, potassium chloride. Administered IV, in sufficient concentration, would cause cardiac arrest in minutes. It metabolized fast enough that a standard post-mortem tox screen wouldn't catch it unless the examining physician specifically ordered the test and had reason to suspect it. On a post-surgical patient with documented chest trauma, a cardiac event would be logged, grieved, and closed. Thomas Greer would have died in room 214, and the cause of death would have read as a complication of his injuries, and the network he'd spent 14 months surveilling would have survived. And the person inside Hargrove General who directed his assassination would have gone back to their regular schedule. She'd been moved out of clinical rotation to make sure she wasn't there to notice. The precision of that bothered her. Not because it was frightening. Fear was a useful signal, but a poor advisor, and she'd learned to treat it accordingly, but because it implied a level of operational planning that extended well beyond the hospital's walls. Someone had looked at the facility, identified the personnel most likely to recognize an unconventional threat, and neutralized that person's access before the operation began. They'd underestimated one thing. They'd assumed that removing her from the floor was the same as removing her from the building. She got out of her car. But the administrative wing had 2 entrances, the main corridor access, which required a badge, and a connecting door through the medical records annex that had been propped open for 3 years by a doorstop that maintenance had never gotten around to removing because the facilities team was perpetually understaffed. Mara knew about it because she used it to drop off late documentation when she came off overnight shifts and the main access was locked for cleaning. She used it now. The records annex was empty at this hour. 1 overhead light on a motion sensor, filing cabinets, the particular dead smell of rooms that processed a lot of paper. She moved through it without touching anything and into the connecting hallway, which curved toward the executive suite at the back of the administrative wing. She wasn't going to Aldridge's office. She was going to the server room. Every hospital ran its access logs through a central server, physical entry records, badge reads, elevator calls, terminal access. And Hargrove General's server room was in the administrative wing because it had been built before anyone seriously thought about separating administrative infrastructure from clinical systems. She'd never had a reason to care about this before tonight. The server room was locked with a keypad. She stood in front of it for a moment and thought about what she knew about administrative staff habits, which included the fact that Hargrove General had done a building-wide security update 14 months ago, and the IT director had sent a memo asking all wing supervisors to update their access codes. She also knew that approximately 60% of people in a building update cycle change their code to their department extension because humans under deadline pressure default to information they already have memorized. She tried the administrative wing extension. The door opened. She had exactly the same thought she always had when something like that worked. This is why security professionals drink. Inside the server room, it was cold and loud. The specific white noise of cooling fans running in banks, the blink of indicator lights across rack-mounted hardware. She didn't touch the servers. She was looking for the physical access log terminal, which was a separate system, older hardware, the kind that kept records locally before pushing them to the cloud backup. She found it. She pulled up the access log for the last 72 hours. She wasn't looking for what was there. She was looking for what had been deleted. Log gaps, periods where the timestamp jumped forward without corresponding entries, were the fingerprints of someone who knew how the system worked but hadn't had enough time to cover the gap cleanly. She found 3, 2 in the last 48 hours, 1 from 6 days ago. She photographed each screen with the camera on the small secondary phone she carried. Her actual phone was in her bag, potentially monitored, and she moved back through the annex the way she'd come, replacing the records room exactly as she'd found it, and she was back in the main corridor in under 12 minutes. Her knee complained on the stairs. She ignored it. In the parking structure, she sat in her car again and looked at the photographs on the secondary phone and thought about what the gaps meant. They corresponded to entry records. Someone entering a secured area during off hours without a logged badge read, which was only possible if the badge read had been manually deleted after the fact by someone with administrative access to the system. That level of access belonged to 3 people at Hargrove General: Director Aldridge, Tanya Briggs, and the head of IT operations, a man named Douglas Farwell, who had worked at the hospital for 9 years and whose name had never once appeared on Mara's radar in any context that suggested he was anything other than exactly what he presented himself as. She sent the photographs to the number Sinclair had given her. The response came back in 4 minutes. Confirmed. Don't go back in. We have it. She put the phone in her jacket pocket. She sat in the parking structure in the cold and the dark and thought about Thomas Greer in room 214, chest tube draining bloody fluid into a collection chamber, lying in a bed in a hospital that was actively trying to finish killing him. She thought about the 7 years she'd spent trying to make the distance between her past and her present feel real, the apartment she'd furnished carefully, the plant she'd learned to keep alive, the colleagues she'd had beers with after difficult shifts, the slow accumulation of ordinary things that added up to something that looked from the outside like a civilian life. She thought about the word Greer had said. Warden, not her name, her function. The thing she'd been when the situation required it. The person who held the perimeter, who made the hard call, who understood that some problems didn't resolve themselves and didn't wait for the right moment and didn't care what you'd decided to become in the years since you'd last faced them. She started the car. She drove home. She did not sleep. The call came at 5:17 a.m. Sinclair, direct line. We have a problem, she said without preamble, which meant the problem was urgent. Greer's being moved. Mara sat up. She was already dressed. She'd lain on top of the bed covers, jacket on, because she'd known the night wasn't finished. Where? That's the problem. The transfer order came through the hospital system at 4:50 a.m. It's logged as a physician request, except the physician whose credentials were used has been on vacation in New Mexico since Monday. Someone used a stolen physician login to generate a transfer order, Mara said. At 4:50 in the morning, Sinclair confirmed, which means whoever generated it knew we'd be watching by daylight. They're trying to move him before we can lock the building. Where's the transfer taking him? Ostensibly to a specialist facility in Portland. The transport company is listed as MedRoutes Northwest. A pause. MedRoutes Northwest dissolved its business registration 14 months ago. Ghost Transport. A vehicle and crew that existed on paper for exactly as long as it needed to, that would drive Greer out of a federal surveillance perimeter and into whatever came next, which would not be a specialist facility. How long until transport arrives? Current ETA 40 minutes, maybe less if they pushed departure time up. Why are you calling me? Mara asked. You have agents in the building. We have 2 agents in the building. The overnight security sweep flagged a technical anomaly in our comm system 20 minutes ago. Someone's running a signal scrambler from inside the facility. Local communications are degraded. My people can't reach each other internally, and I can't reach them at all. Sinclair's voice was controlled, but the edges were showing. I'm 45 minutes away. Reyes is on his way back, but he's 40 minutes out. There it was. The math was simple and ugly. 2 isolated agents in a building with a compromised communications network, a ghost transport arriving in 40 minutes, and a patient in room 214 who was the only living witness capable of identifying the people at the top of a network that had been running long enough to have people inside a defense intelligence operation. What are the agents' positions? Mara asked. Sinclair gave her the last known locations. One near the ER loading bay, one on the 3rd floor near the surgical suites. The scrambler, Mara said. You said it's running from inside the facility. Do you have a position on it? A brief pause. East side, 2nd floor. But we haven't been able to narrow it further. 2nd floor, east side. She knew that wing, outpatient imaging, administrative overflow, and the hospital's communications hub, which was where the building's internal phone system routed through. If someone had placed a scrambler near the communications hub, they'd have degraded not just the agent's radios, but the hospital's own internal network, which meant the nursing station call system, the physician paging system, the elevator intercoms, the fire suppression panel, Mara said. Pardon? The fire suppression panel for the East Wing is hardwired and runs on a completely separate circuit from the hospital's main network. It's the one system in that wing that a radio scrambler won't touch. She was already moving, phone against her ear, pulling her jacket straight. If your agents know to use the fire panel intercom, the inspection port on each floor, they can communicate. It runs floor to floor on a dedicated line. Silence on the other end. Then, how do you know that? I worked a code blue 3 years ago where the main paging system went down during a power fluctuation. Facilities showed us the backup systems during the post-incident review. She was at her door. It's not classified information. It's just the kind of thing you remember if you pay attention. Miss Voss, Sinclair's voice shifted fractionally. I cannot authorize you to enter that building right now. I know. If you go back in there without authorization and something goes wrong, I know, Mara said again. Call me when Reyes is 10 minutes out. She hung up. Desum. She parked in the physician's lot this time, lower camera coverage, closer to the east entrance, and used her badge, which apparently hadn't been deactivated yet, which was either an administrative oversight or a piece of luck she wasn't going to examine too carefully. Inside, the hospital was in that strange pre-dawn state, half the overhead lights on night mode, the pace slower, the staffing reduced, the whole building exhaling before the morning shift arrived. She walked the main corridor at the pace of someone who belonged there, which she did, technically, for approximately another few hours before her suspension was officially processed. She found the communications hub room on the 2nd floor east. The door was unlocked, another oversight, or a sign that whoever had placed the scrambler had needed quick access and hadn't wanted to leave evidence of forced entry. The device was behind the cable management rack on the left wall. Small, the size of a thick paperback, matte black, clamped to a conduit pipe with 2 industrial zip ties. She looked at it without touching it. It would need to be recovered as evidence. And she photographed it, then walked 2 doors down to the fire suppression panel and pulled the inspection port cover. The intercom inside crackled when she activated it. This is Voss, she said quietly. I'm at the 2nd floor fire panel, east wing. If either agent can hear this, respond on the fire panel nearest your position. Static. Then a voice she recognized as belonging to one of the agents from last night. She hadn't gotten a name. Came through broken but readable. Copy, Voss. 3rd floor. What's your status? The scrambler is in the communications hub, 2nd floor east, behind the left rack. Don't remove it. Photograph and leave in place. She paused. Ghost transport is inbound for Greer, 40 minutes, possibly less. I need you to secure 214 and make sure nothing moves him before Reyes arrives. Copy. The other agent? I'll find him. Go. She walked the fire panel circuit to the first floor. The agent near the ER loading bay was a woman named Tess, she found out later. Dark jacket, mid-30s, positioned at the far end of the loading corridor with the specific stillness of someone who had been told to hold and had been holding for 22 minutes without knowing why communications had dropped. Mara found her via the first-floor fire panel and relayed everything in under 90 seconds. Tess moved without questions, which was the thing about good field training. When the situation shifted, you adapted and asked for clarification afterward. The transport arrived at 5:58 a.m. Not 40 minutes. 41. The vehicle was a white medical transport van with MedRoutes Northwest livery. Professionally done, the kind that would pass a casual check. And it pulled into the loading bay with two people in the front, both in transport uniforms. They were met by Tess and the third-floor agent, who had come down the stairs, and by two hospital security officers who had been quietly briefed by Tess in the preceding 8 minutes, and the handover was direct and unambiguous. The driver asked for the transfer paperwork. Tess showed him a different kind of paperwork. The two men from the transport van were detained in the loading bay without incident. Mara watched from the end of the corridor. She wasn't supposed to be there. She stayed anyway, because she'd learned that being somewhere you weren't supposed to be was sometimes the only reliable way to make sure something went correctly. At 6:14 a.m., Reyes arrived. He looked at the loading bay. He looked at the two men in flex cuffs. He looked at Mara. "I thought Sinclair told you to go home," he said. "She told me not to go back in," Mara said. "I was already in." He looked at her for a long moment. "The scrambler," he said. "Communications hub. Second floor east. Behind the left rack." He looked at her for another moment. "Thank you," he said. It came out like a word he wasn't entirely accustomed to saying in professional context, but had decided was accurate. She nodded. She turned to go. The lobby was beginning to fill with the first arrivals of the morning shift. Nurses in scrubs, admin staff with coffee, the overnight residents doing the walk of fatigue toward the exit. Ordinary, routine, the hospital coming back to life. Mara moved through it toward the main exit, and she was almost there, 10 feet from the automatic doors, the pale morning light coming through the glass, when she heard her name. Not her call sign. Her name. She turned. Dr. Elliot Cass was standing 20 feet behind her, not in his usual position of institutional authority, not moving through the space with the particular briskness of a man whose time was more valuable than other people's. He was standing still, which was unusual enough to make her pay attention. His face had a quality she hadn't seen on it before. Not the dismissiveness she was used to, not the controlled condescension. Something closer to confusion, or the preliminary stage of something Elliot Cass probably didn't experience very often: concern. "What's happening?" he asked. Not rhetorically. An actual question. She looked at him. She thought about Sinclair's instruction. Don't signal anything to anyone. She thought about the list of people who could have provided operational information to the network inside the hospital, and whether Cass was on it. She decided in the 3 seconds she had to decide that he wasn't. Not because he was a good person. She had no strong evidence either way about Cass as a person. But because his confusion was real. A man who was part of the operation running through this hospital would not be standing in the lobby at 6 in the morning looking like someone had rearranged the furniture in a room he knew well. "Go to your office," she said. "Lock the door. Don't talk to Director Aldridge or anyone from her team today." He stared at her. "Why?" "Because I'm telling you to," she said. "And because the patient you saved yesterday—" "The patient you saved yesterday," he said, and the correction came out with a slight roughness to it, like something that had cost him something small but real to say. "What about him?" "He's going to be okay," Mara said. "Go to your office, Dr. Cass." She pushed through the automatic doors and out into the morning. The air outside was cold and sharp and carried the particular smell of a Pacific Northwest morning: wet pavement, Douglas fir, the far edge of the ocean. She breathed it in once, fully. Somewhere in the building behind her, Thomas Greer was alive in room 214. Somewhere in the administrative wing, Catherine Aldridge was at her desk or near it, running communications that were being traced in real time. wrapping herself more thoroughly in a network she probably believed was still intact. Somewhere down the chain that Greer had spent 14 months mapping, people were waiting for a report that was not going to come. Mara walked to her car. She sat in it. The secondary phone lit up with a message from Sinclair. "We have enough on Briggs. She's talking. This goes further than we thought. Stay reachable." She set the phone on the passenger seat. She looked at her hands for a moment, both of them, right and left, resting on the steering wheel. The left knuckle on her index finger was slightly swollen from last night. The bruise on her knee was making the leg stiff when she bent it. She was tired in the way that lived behind the eyes and in the shoulders, the kind that coffee didn't touch. She was also, in a way she hadn't expected and wasn't quite sure what to do with, more awake than she'd been in 7 years. She started the car, and then the secondary phone lit up again. Not a message this time, an incoming call, from a number she didn't recognize. And something in the specific quality of that, the unknown number on a secured line that only 3 people had, made her very still before she picked it up. She answered. There was no voice on the other end, just breathing. And then, very quietly, a sound she recognized, the soft triple tone of a hospital patient monitor flatlining, followed by a voice she didn't recognize at all, low and even. "Major Voss? We know you were in the building tonight. We know what you photographed." A pause. "We also know you care about the people on that surgical ward." The line went dead. Mara's hand tightened on the phone. She looked at the hospital through the windshield. The glass entrance, the morning light catching it, the ordinary traffic of shift change moving in and out. She thought about who else was on that surgical ward. Not just Greer. Patients. Real patients. Post-operative, sedated, with lines and tubes and a specific terrible vulnerability to anyone willing to walk through a door they weren't supposed to walk through. She thought about the flatline tone. She thought about Sinclair, 45 minutes away, her agents positioned and stretched thin, the scrambler removed but the network still active, still communicating through channels they hadn't fully traced. She thought about who she'd been for the last 7 years. Then she thought about who she'd been before that. She picked up the main phone and called Sinclair. "They just made contact," she said when Sinclair answered. "Indirect threat to the surgical ward. They know what I photographed." She kept her voice even. "How many patients are in surgical recovery right now?" 11, Sinclair said, after a 2-second pause that meant she'd checked something. "Voss, you need more people in that building," Mara said. "Right now, not in 40 minutes. "I'm working on it." "Work faster." Mara looked at the hospital. "And I need you to give me something." "What?" "The name," she said. "The person above Aldridge, the one the network reports to." She paused. "Because whoever made that call just told me they're not done, and I need to know what I'm actually dealing with." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Mara counted her own heartbeats. Then Sinclair said a name. And Mara recognized it. Not from her 7 years at Hargrove General. Not from the civilian life she'd built carefully around the edges of someone she used to be. From before. From a briefing she'd sat in 11 years ago, in a room she hadn't been authorized to be in, listening to a name attached to a financial network that had been running through defense contracts since before she'd joined the Army. A name that had come up twice in connection with operations she'd been part of, and twice been deemed outside the scope of her unit's mandate. A name that had apparently never stopped being relevant. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Long enough," Sinclair said. "Greer was the first solid thread we've had." Mara looked at the hospital. 11 patients in surgical recovery. Thomas Greer, who had set her call sign with 3 seconds of consciousness and held on until she moved. A flatline tone on a phone line, delivered as a warning or a promise, or both. She opened the car door. "I'm going back in," she said. "Voss, send people," she said. "I'll hold until they arrive." She didn't wait for an answer. The automatic doors opened as she approached, and the hospital swallowed her back into its noise and light and ordinary chaos. And somewhere on the second floor, in a room with a window overlooking the service bay, Thomas Greer's monitors beeped with the quiet persistence of a man who was still alive. For now. The surgical ward smelled the same at 6 in the morning as it did at any other hour. Antiseptic and recycled air and the faint metallic undercurrent of recovery rooms everywhere. But Mara moved through it differently now, reading it the way she'd learned to read spaces that looked safe and weren't. 11 patients in surgical recovery. She did the math without meaning to. 11 patients, each with a primary nurse, each connected to monitoring equipment that reported to the central station at the end of the corridor. One nursing supervisor on overnight. 2 techs. The attending on call was down the hall in the resident lounge, theoretically available within 90 seconds of a page. Theoretically. She didn't stop at the nursing station. She walked the length of the ward first, moving at the pace of someone doing a routine check, nodding to the night nurse who looked up from her charting with the tired expression of someone 90 minutes from end of shift. The rooms were mostly dark inside, curtains drawn, monitors glowing, the slow, regular patterns of people who were sedated or simply exhausted from what their bodies had just been through. Room 214 was at the far end. Greer was awake. She knew he would be. She slipped inside and pulled the door mostly closed behind her. His eyes tracked her from the moment she crossed the threshold. That same alert quality she'd noticed the night before. A man running on inadequate post-surgical rest and something that was either adrenaline or professional habit, possibly both. They made contact, she said quietly. Not a question. 20 minutes ago, someone tried the door, he said. His voice was still rough but stronger than last night. Night nurse ran them off. Thought it was a wrong room. It wasn't a wrong room. No. She moved to the window. The service bay was quiet, the transport van gone, the loading area empty. In the pale early light, the parking structure showed 3 cars that hadn't been there at midnight. She looked at them. Sinclair give you anything? Greer asked. She gave me a name. He was quiet for a moment. Harlan Voss, he said. She turned, looked at him. Not your family, he said immediately. Just the name. I know who he is, she said. I've known the name for 11 years. Then you know he doesn't send one person, Greer said. He sends enough to guarantee the outcome. The guy last night was the opener. He shifted, grimaced. The chest tube was still in. It would be for another day at minimum, and she could see from the drainage output that his left lung was still weeping. He was running on stubbornness and institutional conditioning and not much else. How many agents does Sinclair have incoming? She didn't say, which means not enough. He looked at the window. What's your read on the building? The scrambler's been removed. Comms are restored. Tess and the other agent are positioned at the ward entry points. She paused. But the network inside the hospital is still active. At least one more person we haven't identified. Farwell, Greer said. She looked at him. Douglas Farwell, IT director. He's been running the server access logs for 18 months, deleting entry records, managing the internal communication intercepts. Greer's voice was matter-of-fact. Aldridge runs the administrative cover. Briggs runs the logistics. Farwell makes sure there's no digital record. The 3 of them have kept this embedded here for 2 years. You knew all of this before last night. Most of it. He met her eyes. I knew you were here. I knew your record. I asked to be extracted through Denton Falls specifically. There it was. She'd suspected it from the moment Sinclair had confirmed the file access. But suspecting something and hearing it confirmed were different, and she spent a second with the difference. The particular feeling of having been maneuvered, even if the maneuvering had ultimately saved his life. You used me, she said. Not angry. Accurate. I needed someone in that building I could trust, he said. Someone who would recognize what they were looking at. He held her gaze without flinching. I'm not going to pretend it was anything other than what it was. She looked at him for a moment, then she looked back at the window. The name Sinclair gave me, she said. Harlan Voss. You've been building a case against him. 14 months of it. And you're the only living witness who can put him at the top of the network. Currently, he said. Yes. She thought about that, the specific precarious weight of currently, and she thought about the flatline tone on the phone, and she thought about 11 patients in surgical recovery and a man in a hospital bed with a chest tube and a target he'd been carrying for over a year. Then we need to get you out of this building, she said. Sinclair's working on a secure transfer. Sinclair's 45 minutes away and the network just told me they know what I photographed. She turned from the window. They know the scrambler's been found. They know the transport was intercepted. They know the timeline is collapsing. She kept her voice level. A man like Harlan Voss doesn't wait for a second window. He closes the first one. Greer looked at her with the particular expression of someone recalibrating their assessment of a situation. You think they're moving now. I think the call I received was not a warning, she said. I think it was a distraction. She left Greer's room and moved to the nursing station. The night supervisor, a woman named Petra, mid-40s, the collected manner of someone who had run overnight surgical wards for a long time, looked up from her station with the mild curiosity of someone who recognized Mara, but was aware that Mara was currently on administrative suspension. You're not supposed to be, Petra began. I know, Mara said. I need you to listen to me for 60 seconds and then make a decision. Petra looked at her. Whatever she saw in Mara's face made her put down her pen. Go ahead. There is a security situation in this building. Federal agents are involved and backup is inbound. In the next 30 minutes, someone may attempt to access one or more patients on this ward using false credentials or a faked transfer order. She kept it simple, kept it moving. I need you to flag any request to move a patient, any room, as requiring secondary authorization from a physician who is physically present in this building, not paged, present. Petra was quiet for a moment. This is about the patient in 214. Partly. The men who came through last night were part of it. Yes. Mara held her gaze. 60 seconds. That's what I asked for. You've used about 40. A longer pause. Then Petra straightened in her chair. I can flag any transfer request. I can require in-person physician authorization. She picked up her pen. What's the flag code? Make one up, Mara said. Something you'll remember and they won't know to ask about. Something shifted in Petra's expression. Not quite amusement, but its neighbor. I'll use Protocol 14. Does Protocol 14 exist? It does now, Petra said. Mara moved. The call to test took 30 seconds through the restored internal system. 3 short words, East Stairwell, now, and they met on the landing between the first and second floors, which had no camera coverage because the stairwell camera had been tagged for replacement for 8 months. Tess was alert, compact, the kind of tired that had been overridden by circumstance. What do you have? She said. The call was a distraction. They're not going for Greer directly. Too visible after last night. They're going to try something that looks clinical. Mara kept her voice low. An event. A patient crash. Something that empties the hallway and pulls staff away from 214 long enough to make a move. Tess processed that. A staged event. Possibly induced. If Farwell still has system access, he can manipulate the monitoring feed, create a false alarm in another room, pull nursing staff, isolate 214. She paused. Or an actual event, induced event, different patient, creates genuine chaos, harder to recognize in the moment. An induced cardiac event, Tess said, like what they tried last night. Different patient, less conspicuous. The thought settled in Mara's chest with the particular weight of something she needed to say clearly. They will hurt an innocent person to create cover. These are not people who hesitate about collateral damage. Tess pulled out her radio, checked the signal. Restored. Clear. I'm calling the third-floor agent down to cover the ward entry. You stay with Greer. Farwell, Mara said. He's the one with system access. If he's in the building, I'll find him. Tess was already moving up the stairs. Go. Mara was back on the surgical ward in under 3 minutes. She nodded to Petra at the station, took a position in the corridor with a clear sight line to 214 and the ward's main entry, and she waited. She was good at waiting. She'd spent a significant portion of her adult life developing the specific skill of waiting without visibly waiting, looking occupied, looking purposeful, while the actual function was observation. She'd done it in field hospitals, and forward operating bases, and military briefing rooms, and now, apparently, in a Pacific Northwest hospital corridor at 6:20 in the morning. At 6:31, the monitor in room 208 alarmed. Not the slow escalation of a deteriorating patient, the sudden flatline tone of a monitor that had registered a critical event. Petra was on her feet immediately, calling down the corridor, one tech sprinting toward 208. The overnight attending appeared from the resident lounge, moving fast, paging someone on his way. Mara did not move toward 208. She watched the corridor instead. The nursing station was suddenly partially unmanned. Petra at 208, both techs at 208, the attending at 208. 40 feet of corridor between the ward entry and room 214, with one night nurse remaining at the far end of the ward and the station temporarily empty. She watched the ward entry. 30 seconds passed. A man in scrubs entered the ward. Unfamiliar face, moving with the specific casual purpose of someone who had rehearsed the walk, who had practiced looking like he belonged. He was carrying a medication transport case, the sealed kind used for controlled substances, which required a specific log process and a nurse's signature. He moved toward the nursing station. He saw the station was empty. He pivoted, almost imperceptibly, the slight redirection of a man recalculating, toward the corridor, toward 214. Mara stepped in front of him. "Medication delivery needs to be logged at the station," she said. "Station's occupied with an emergency. You'll need to wait." He stopped, looked at her. His eyes did the thing that trained people's eyes did when they encountered an unexpected obstacle. A rapid, almost invisible assessment, running options. "It's a time-sensitive delivery," he said. "Everything in a hospital is time-sensitive," she said pleasantly. "Station will be clear in a few minutes." A beat. He looked down the corridor toward 214. She moved slightly, a shift of weight that was casual in appearance and was not casual in any other sense, and the angle of her body changed in a way that would require him to go through her to continue down that corridor. "What's the patient name on the delivery?" she asked, a fraction of a second too long before he answered. "I'll need to check the order," he said. "Sure," she said. "We can do that at the station." He didn't move toward the station. She'd been in enough situations to know what the next 3 seconds would look like before they happened. His weight shifting back, the decision already made, the case coming up. And she was already moving when he moved, inside his reach before the case had fully swung, and she took his wrist in both hands and drove it down and back, and the case hit the floor, and the contents scattered across the tile. And she had him against the wall, with his arm pinned before the sound of it finished echoing. He was strong, stronger than the man from the bathroom, more trained, and he got a knee up that she deflected at the cost of a sharp pain in her forearm. Not broken, she assessed in real time, but she'd feel that for a week. And he almost broke the pin twice before Tess came through the ward entry at a run with the third-floor agent behind her. It took all three of them another 40 seconds to fully control him. On the floor where the transport case had spilled, among the scattered packaging, was a single pre-filled syringe. Tess photographed it before anyone touched it. The room that the man from 208 was actually experiencing was not a cardiac event. Mara worked this out while Tess handled the detained courier Sess. His credentials, the coverage story, what he'd say, all of it would be Sinclair's problem when she arrived. Because the monitor in 208 had alarmed with the specific pattern of a disconnected lead rather than an actual arrhythmia, which meant the alarm had been triggered by someone physically disconnecting a monitoring lead on a patient, which was either an extraordinarily unfortunate accidental dislodgement or it was deliberate. The patient in 208 was a 62-year-old man, post-appendectomy, not a surgical risk, not in any condition that would naturally produce a critical alarm. He was sitting up when the attending reached him, confused about why the room was suddenly full of people, with a monitoring lead lying across his blanket that had been neatly detached from its adhesive pad. Neatly detached. Not pulled loose by movement, detached deliberately, which meant someone had been in that room in the preceding 10 minutes and had created the distraction on a schedule, timed to pull staff from the corridor at the moment the courier entered the ward. Someone who had access to 208 during the window between 6:15 and 6:30 a.m. Mara looked at the ward entry log Petra had been maintaining, the list of personnel who had badged into the ward. Douglas Farwell had badged in at 6:19, IT director. No clinical reason to be on a surgical ward at 6:19 in the morning. But Hargrove General's IT department held master badge access to every area of the building for maintenance and infrastructure purposes, and that access had never been restricted because nobody had ever had a reason to restrict it. Until now. She found Tess. Farwell badged into the ward at 6:19. He's still in the building. Tess pulled her radio. 2 words. Lock it down. They found Farwell in the stairwell between the second and third floors. He'd apparently intended to exit via the roof access, which connected to the building's HVAC maintenance walkway, and from there to a service ladder on the building's east side, a route that a man who had spent 9 years managing the hospital's physical infrastructure would know existed. He was sitting on the landing with the particular composure of a man who had already run through his options and found none of them viable. He looked up when the agents appeared. "I want a lawyer," he said. "That's your right," Tess told him. "I'm not saying anything else." "That's also your right." He sat on the landing and said nothing else, and they stayed with him until Sinclair arrived at 7:02 a.m., and the situation became formally and officially not Mara's problem. Tut. Sinclair did not look like a woman who had driven 45 minutes at pre-dawn speed and arrived to find 3 detained individuals, 2 recovered syringes, 1 photographed scrambler, and a patient still alive in room 214. She looked like a woman completing a step in a process she'd been running for a long time. She found Mara in the corridor outside Greer's room. "Farwell's not talking," Mara said. "He will," Sinclair said. "When he understands what Briggs already gave us, he'll talk." She looked at Mara's forearm, which was visibly swelling at the wrist. "You need that looked at. It's a bruise. It might be a fracture." "It's a bruise," Mara said again. "What happens now?" Sinclair was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant she was deciding how much to share, which was Sinclair's default mode and something Mara had already adjusted for. "We have enough to move on Aldridge. The evidence from Briggs combined with the server logs you photographed last night gives us a pattern going back 22 months. She paused. "What we don't have yet is the chain above Aldridge. Farwell knows some of it. Briggs knows less. Aldridge knows more. And Greer knows all of it," Mara said. "Greer knows enough," Sinclair said. "His testimony, combined with 14 months of surveillance documentation, gives us Harlan Voss directly." Mara looked at the door to 214. "He needs to be moved. Not a ghost transport. Actual secure transfer." "It's being arranged. 2 hours. 2 hours is a long time." "I have 4 agents in this building now," Sinclair said, "and I'm personally not leaving." She looked at Mara steadily. "You should go get your arm looked at and then go home and sleep. You've been awake for 26 hours, Mara said. "I'm aware." "You did good work tonight," Sinclair said. It came out plainly, without the particular hesitation that compliments often carried when they were coming from someone who didn't give them often. "Better than good." Mara looked at her. "The name you gave me. Harlan Voss." She kept her voice level. "The file access, my classified record. He's the one who pulled it." "We believe so. Yes." "He was looking for me specifically." Sinclair was quiet for one careful second. "There's a component of this operation we haven't discussed yet." "I know," Mara said. "When we have Greer secure—" "I know," Mara said again. "Tell me when you need me." She left through the main entrance into a morning that had become fully day while she wasn't paying attention. Clear sky, the sun clearing the ridgeline to the east, the parking lot busy with the normal morning shift changeover, all of it lit and ordinary and ongoing. Her arm hurt. Her knee hurt. She was tired in a way that had weight to it. She sat in her car and thought about nothing for approximately 4 minutes. Then she drove to the urgent care clinic 2 miles from the hospital because the forearm genuinely might be fractured and she was not going to be useful to anyone if she ignored it. It was a fracture, small, non-displaced. The urgent care physician, a young man who looked recently graduated and who had the particular focused seriousness of someone who was good at his job and knew it, splinted it efficiently and told her to follow up with orthopedics and avoid lifting. "Avoid lifting," she repeated. "Anything over 5 pounds, he said. "For at least 2 weeks." She drove home. She slept for 4 hours, which was not enough and was also all she was going to get, because at 11:47 a.m., the secured phone rang and it was Sinclair, and Sinclair's voice had a quality in it that was different from every previous call. "Greer is secure," Sinclair said. "Transfer went clean." "Good," Mara said. "Aldridge has been taken into federal custody. Her office is being processed right now." A brief pause. "She's asking to speak to her attorney, and then, apparently she's asking to speak to you." Mara sat up. "To me?" "Specifically to you," Sinclair said. "She hasn't explained why, but she's been consistent about it since the moment we cuffed her." Another pause. "I need to know if you're willing." Outside Mara's apartment window, Denton Falls was running through its midday. Traffic, pedestrians, the ordinary noise of a city that didn't know anything unusual had happened overnight in one of its hospitals. "When?" Mara asked. "This afternoon. We'll come to you." "All right," Mara said. She hung up. She looked at the splint on her forearm, white fiberglass, slightly awkward, already annoying. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about Catherine Aldridge, who had run a hospital for 6 years, and somewhere along the way had become a component of a criminal network that killed people to protect itself, and who was now apparently sitting in federal custody asking for a nurse she'd had suspended less than 24 hours ago. She thought about what that meant, what Aldridge might know, what Aldridge might be willing to trade. She was still thinking about it when her personal phone rang, the ordinary one, not the secured line, and she looked at the screen and saw a name she hadn't expected. Dr. Elliot Cass. She stared at it for a moment. She answered. "I went to my office," he said, without preamble. "Like you told me to. And I've been sitting here for 5 hours because I figured you knew something I didn't, and I should wait." He paused. "The hospital just sent a building-wide message that Director Aldridge is unavailable for administrative matters pending a review. Tanya Briggs is also listed as unavailable. And there are 3 people in what look like federal jackets going through the 4th-floor administrative suite." "Yes," Mara said. "You knew this was coming." "Yes." Another pause. Longer. "The patient from the overflow," he said. "The man I operated on. He's safe." She could hear Cass in his office. The particular acoustic quality of a room with medical textbooks and a window overlooking the hospital's front approach. And she could hear him trying to fit together a picture from the pieces he had, which were substantial but incomplete. "Who are you?" he said. It wasn't quite what he meant, and she thought he knew it. What he meant was closer to, "What are you? What have I been dismissing for 4 years?" "I'm a nurse," she said. I've been telling you that." A long silence. "The complaint I filed," he said. "Yes. I should withdraw it." "Probably," she agreed. He was quiet again. She could hear him deciding something. Not the easy thing, but the accurate thing, which took longer to reach because it required you to look at your own behavior with the same precision you applied to everyone else's, which most people found difficult, and Elliot Cass, in her estimation, would find exceptionally difficult because he was a man who had built a significant portion of his professional identity on the assumption that his assessments were correct. "I'll file the withdrawal today," he said. His voice was flat in the particular way of someone who had decided to do something they weren't comfortable with and wasn't going to make it sound comfortable. "And I want to—" He stopped. "You don't need to," she said. "I want to say that I was wrong about you." He got through it quickly, the way people got through things that cost them. Not just about the imaging decision. Generally, over the last 4 years. She looked at the ceiling of her apartment. "Okay," she said. "That's it? What do you want me to say, Dr. Cass?" A beat. "Elliot," he said. "Under the circumstances, I think you can call me Elliot." "Okay, Elliot," she said. "Go home, get some sleep. The building's in good hands." She ended the call. Sinclair arrived at 2:30 with Reyes and a third agent Mara hadn't met, and they sat in Mara's small living room, Sinclair on the couch, Mara in the chair across from her, her splinted arm resting on the armrest, the afternoon light coming through the window at the angle that caught the dust she hadn't gotten around to dealing with. And Sinclair laid out what Aldridge had said. Not everything. Enough. Aldridge had been recruited 4 years ago, not 2. The network had been embedded in Hargrove General for longer than anyone had tracked. She hadn't known who she was ultimately working for. She knew the operational contact, a man named Price, who had presented himself as a private defense contractor who had offered financial arrangements that made the hospital's chronic funding shortfall significantly less chronic, and who had asked in return for specific accommodations, controlled access to the facility, selective blind spots in the record system, the ability to move certain individuals through the hospital's infrastructure, admissions, transfers, temporary identification, without documentation, and occasionally, when necessary, the removal of inconvenient complications. Greer wasn't the first, Sinclair said. We believe there were 2 previous incidents at Hargrove General that were logged as natural patient deaths, predating Greer's operation. Mara absorbed this. How many hospitals? She asked. Sinclair looked at her. How many hospitals in the network? Mara said. Because Hargrove General isn't a major facility. It's a regional hospital in a mid-sized city. If someone is using hospitals as infrastructure, for access, for cover, for asset movement, they're not doing it in one location. Sinclair was quiet for a moment. 7, she said. That we've confirmed. 7 hospitals. Mara looked at her splinted arm, at the dust in the afternoon light, at the ordinary furniture of the life she'd been living for 7 years. The reason Aldridge asked for me, she said. She knows who I am. Price told her, Sinclair said. When your record was accessed 3 days ago, he told her you'd been at the hospital for 4 years and hadn't been activated, which meant you were either genuinely retired or you'd been placed there. She thought I was placed there, Mara said. She thought you were watching her, Sinclair said. For the whole 4 years. The almost absurdity of it sat in the room for a moment. 4 years of Catherine Aldridge running a criminal network inside a hospital, while believing the veteran trauma nurse on her 4th-floor ward was a long-term surveillance asset watching her do it. She wants to deal, Mara said. She wants to deal, Sinclair confirmed. And she wants you present for the conversation because she believes you're the one who can confirm that her cooperation is genuine. A pause. I told her I'd ask. Mara looked out the window. She thought about the 2 previous patients, the ones logged as natural deaths, the ones who had died in a regional hospital from events that had probably looked, in the moment, exactly like what they were supposed to look like. She thought about their families, about what those families had been told. When? She said. Tomorrow morning, Sinclair said. Federal building downtown. I'll be there. Sinclair stood to go. At the door, she turned back. Your suspension, she said. The complaint from Cass is being withdrawn as of today. The administrative action against you will be voided through the review process, but given the circumstances, it'll take a few weeks, Mara said. Probably. I know how institutions work, Mara said. It's fine. After Sinclair left, the apartment was quiet in the particular way of spaces that have been full of people and then aren't. Mara sat in the chair for a while. The afternoon moved through the window. Outside, Denton Falls continued its ordinary business. She thought about 7 hospitals. She thought about Harlan Voss, whose name she'd known for 11 years, who had apparently known her name for at least 3 days. She thought about Greer and whatever secure facility Sinclair had transferred him to, with his chest tube and his 14 months of documentation and the testimony that was going to put a name on a network that had apparently been running long enough to have embedded itself in 7 hospitals across the country. She thought about tomorrow's meeting. She thought about Catherine Aldridge's request. Not for her lawyer, not for immunity, but for her specifically. And she turned it over the way she'd learned to turn things over, looking at it from the angles that weren't immediately obvious. There was something Aldridge knew that she wanted Mara to hear directly. Not something Aldridge wanted Sinclair to have. Sinclair would have it regardless of who was in the room, but something she wanted Mara to understand. Something personal. Mara looked at her splinted arm. She was still looking at it when her secured phone buzzed with a message from Reyes. 3 words. Check the attachment. She opened it. The attachment was a photograph. Surveillance quality, taken from a distance, slightly grainy the way long-lens images were in low-light conditions. It showed the exterior of a building she didn't recognize at first, and then recognized with the specific jolt of something that should not be connected to something else connecting anyway. The building was her apartment complex. The photograph had been taken from the parking structure across the street. The timestamp on the photograph was 11:23 a.m. She had been home at 11:23 a.m. She had been sleeping at 11:23 a.m., with 4 hours of inadequate sleep after 26 hours of being awake, with a fractured wrist and a bruised knee and a secured phone on the nightstand that she hadn't heard buzz. The photograph showed the exterior of her building, and on the 4th floor, in the window that corresponded to her apartment, the faint shape of a figure was visible through the glass. A shape that was not Mara, because Mara had been asleep. She stood up very fast and the chair scraped back and she was already dialing Reyes before she'd fully processed what she was looking at, moving toward her bedroom door, pushing it open. The room was empty. Bed unmade, the way she'd left it. Secured phone on the nightstand. Window closed. She stood in the doorway with the phone ringing in her ear, And she looked at the window and she looked at the lock on the window, and the lock was still engaged and the room was empty. Reyes picked up. "You saw it," he said. "My window," she said. "Someone was in my apartment." "We don't know that. The image is ambiguous." "Reyes." She kept her voice level. "Someone was in my apartment while I was asleep in it." A pause. "We're running the image now. Could be a reflection. Could be a neighbor's window." "Send someone," she said. "Already en route," he said. 10 minutes. She stood in her bedroom doorway and looked at the window, and she looked at the room, really looked at it. The nightstand, the dresser, the closet door that was slightly further open than she'd left it. She hadn't left it open. She crossed to it and pulled it the rest of the way open, and it was her clothes, her shoes, the shelf with her folded spare linens, all of it exactly as she'd left it, except for the small evidence bag sitting on top of the spare blanket that had not been there when she'd gotten home. Small, clear plastic. The kind used for evidence handling. Inside it was a single key card, the kind used for hospital access, and on the back of it, written in small, neat handwriting in black marker, "There are 3 more. You're already late." Mara stood in her open closet and looked at the key card, and the apartment was completely quiet. And outside her window, Denton Falls was still doing its ordinary afternoon, and she thought about 7 hospitals and 3 more, and the precision of a man who had planted something in her apartment while she slept, who had wanted her to find it when she woke, who had timed it for maximum effect, who wanted her afraid. She wasn't afraid. She was something colder than that, and more useful. She pulled out her secured phone and she called Sinclair directly, and when Sinclair answered, she said, "Cancel tomorrow morning. We need to move tonight. Aldridge knows something she hasn't told you yet, and Harlan Voss just told me we're already behind." A beat of silence. Then Sinclair said very quietly, "How do you know that?" "He left me a message," Mara said. "In your apartment." "In my apartment," she confirmed. Another silence, longer this time. "I'm coming to you," Sinclair said. "Don't touch the key card." Mara looked at the clear plastic bag, at the key card inside it, at the handwriting that was small and neat and unhurried, the handwriting of a man who had been inside her home, in the space where she slept, and had taken the time to write carefully. "There are 3 more. You're already late." 3 more. 3 more what? Hospitals, targets, operations already in motion. She didn't know yet, but she was going to find out. Sinclair arrived in 22 minutes. Not the 10 Reyes had estimated, because she'd stopped to pick up 2 additional agents from the field office, and because she'd taken the time to call the forensics team before she left, which meant she arrived with purpose rather than just speed. Mara had used the 22 minutes to do 3 things. She'd photographed the key card through the evidence bag without touching it. She'd walked every room of her apartment with the kind of attention she hadn't applied to her own living space since she'd moved in, checking window locks, closet spaces, the area behind the water heater, the bathroom cabinet, and found nothing else disturbed. And she'd made herself eat something, because she hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon, and her hands were starting to show the particular steadiness that came just before a crash, the body's last performance before it started making errors. She was finishing a piece of toast when Sinclair came through the door. The forensics agent was with her, a woman named Driscoll, efficient and quiet, who moved immediately toward the bedroom without needing to be directed. Reyes followed. The additional 2 agents took up positions near the apartment's entry and window, which told Mara that Sinclair had already decided the threat level had escalated past surveillance and into something that warranted visible security presence. Sinclair looked at the toast. "Good," she said. Not sarcastic, genuine. "Talk to me about the key card," Mara said. "Hospital access. We're running the chip now. If it's a Hargrove General card, we'll have the specific access profile in under an hour." Sinclair sat at Mara's kitchen table, which was a small table designed for one person eating alone and was slightly too small for the conversation they were about to have. The message. 3 more, Mara said. "That's what it said." "Hospitals," Sinclair said. "We think." "You think or you know?" Sinclair looked at her. "When we arrested Aldridge this morning, her phone flagged an outgoing message that we intercepted and decrypted 2 hours ago. It was sent before we cuffed her. She must have had a panic protocol, a triggered message if she went dark." She set her own phone on the table and turned it so Mara could see the screen. She sent a single word to 3 separate numbers. Mara looked at the screen. The word was harvest. She looked at it for a moment. Activation code, she said. That's our read. Sinclair took the phone back. 3 receiving numbers, 2 resolved to burner phones that have been dark since this morning. The third... She paused. The third connected to a network node we've been tracking for 6 weeks in connection with a separate operation out of our Portland field office. It's tied to a hospital in Grants Pass, one in Bend, and one in Eugene. 3 hospitals. There are 3 more. You're already late. Mara Voss hadn't broken into her apartment to threaten her. He'd broken in to show her that he already knew what they knew. That Aldridge's arrest had triggered the activation, that 3 operations were already moving, and that Sinclair's team was behind the timeline. He wanted them running, reactive, stretched across 3 locations while he managed the extraction of whatever assets and evidence he needed to move before the net tightened. He's not running, Mara said. Sinclair looked at her. The message in my apartment, he didn't have to do that. He could have just activated the 3 sites and let us chase it. She looked at the window, at the afternoon light that was moving toward evening now. He left the message because he wanted us to know he was ahead. He wanted the psychological weight of it. She turned back to Sinclair. That's not a man managing his exit. That's a man who thinks he has enough time to play with us first. Sinclair was quiet for a moment. Or he's trying to split our attention, she said. Get us running toward Grants Pass, Bend, and Eugene while he does something else entirely. Both can be true, Mara said. Yes, Sinclair said. They can. The keycard came back clean from the chip read. Not a Hargrove General card, not from any of the 3 flagged hospitals. It was a master format hospital access card, the kind that certain infrastructure contractors use to maintain access across multiple facilities without needing site-specific credentials at each location. The card's serial number traced to a security contractor called Meridian Access Solutions, which had contracts with 14 hospitals in the Pacific Northwest and Northern California. 14. Not 7. 14. Driscoll delivered this information from the bedroom doorway with the particular expression of someone who had been in the business long enough to recalibrate without visible distress. Sinclair absorbed it. Reyes absorbed it. Mara had already been running the math from the moment Sinclair said 7 earlier that afternoon, with the slight hesitation that meant 7 was the confirmed number and the actual number was larger. He's been building this for longer than 14 months, Mara said. Significantly longer, Sinclair said. The 2 patients at Hargrove General, the ones logged as natural deaths before Greer's operation. Mara kept her voice even. Were they the only ones? Sinclair met her eyes and didn't answer immediately, which was an answer. How many hospitals? Mara asked. Actually, not confirmed, your working estimate. 14 confirmed active contracts through Meridian, Sinclair said. Of those, we believe 7 have been used operationally. The other 7 may be infrastructure, access and cover only, no active incidents. She paused. We don't know yet. Mara looked at the key card in its evidence bag, sitting on her kitchen table. The message said I'm already late, she said. He knows we'll move on the 3 hospitals tonight. We're already coordinating with Portland field office, Sinclair said. Teams are being positioned. He knows that too, Mara said. He knew about your agents at Hargrove General. He knew about the scrambler's removal. He knew what I photographed. She looked at Sinclair. He has someone in your operation. The room was very quiet. Driscoll looked at Reyes. Reyes didn't look at anyone. That's a serious statement, Sinclair said. I know, Mara said. How did he know I'd photographed the server logs? The only people who knew about that were you, Reyes, and whoever received the message I sent at 3 in the morning. She kept her voice neutral, factual, not accusatory, accurate. I'm not saying it's anyone in this room. I'm saying the information moved, and it moved fast, and Mara Voss made it to my apartment while I was sleeping and left before your agents arrived. Sinclair looked at her for a long moment. The 3 hospitals, she said finally. We're moving on all 3 tonight regardless. Whatever the internal exposure is, we manage it by compartmentalizing the operation from this point. She stood. Which means the only people who know the specifics of tonight's operations are in this room. And Greer, Mara said. Greer is secure and not in communication with anyone outside his holding facility. He needs to be part of this, Mara said. Whatever moves tonight, Greer's testimony is the thread that connects all of it to Voss directly. If we move on the 3 hospitals and get the evidence and Greer isn't positioned to corroborate, he's not well enough to... He's well enough, Mara said. I've seen his vitals. He's mobile with assistance, the chest tube is out as of this morning, and he's been waiting for this for 14 months. She held Sinclair's gaze. You need him in the room when this breaks, not on the phone. In the room. Sinclair looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman who is recalculating. I'll arrange transport, she said. Oh. The meeting with Aldridge happened that evening, not the following morning, in a federal holding facility 12 miles from Denton Falls. A room with a table and 4 chairs, and the particular acoustics of a space designed to make people feel that every word was being carefully preserved, which it was. Aldridge looked smaller than she did in the hospital, not physically. She was still the same woman, the same composed posture, the same careful grooming even after a day in federal custody. But the institutional authority that she'd worn like a second jacket at Hargrove General was simply absent here, and without it she looked like what she actually was. A 61-year-old woman who had made a series of decisions that had compounded over 4 years into something she hadn't fully understood until the handcuffs went on. She looked at Mara when Mara sat down. You weren't watching me, Aldridge said. It wasn't quite an accusation, more like the completion of a thought she'd been working through all day. No, Mara said. Price told me you were. Price told you what was useful to him, Mara said. He wanted you careful, watchful. He wanted someone inside the hospital who would flag unusual behavior from staff. She paused. He used your fear of me to manage you. Aldridge looked at the table. He said you were an intelligence asset, that Hargrove General had been selected for surveillance. She was quiet for a moment. I believed him because I needed to believe there was a reason for all of it, a larger architecture, something that made the choices I was making feel... She stopped. Authorized, Mara said. Yes. The word came out smaller than the others. Tell me about Price, Mara said. Aldridge looked at Sinclair, who was sitting at the corner of the table with a recorder running and the expression of someone who had heard 100 versions of this kind of conversation. Everything I tell you goes toward my cooperation agreement, Aldridge said. That's between you and the U.S. attorney, Sinclair said. But yes, everything you give us tonight is documented as cooperation. Aldridge folded her hands on the table. She had the hands of a woman who had spent her life in administrative work. No calluses, careful nails, the small signs of someone who had always worked in climate-controlled rooms. She looked at her own hands for a moment. Then she talked. Price's full name was Warren Price, and he had appeared in Aldridge's life 4 years ago as a healthcare infrastructure consultant. Legitimate credentials, legitimate references, a company called Northwest Health Strategies that had a real website and a real office in Seattle, and had done real work for 3 regional hospital systems before it became something else. The transition had been gradual. It usually was. First, it was the financial arrangement. Northwest Health Strategies identifying a grant funding opportunity for Hargrove General, facilitating the application, receiving a placement fee that was within industry norms for that kind of consulting work. Then it was a favor. Could Hargrove General accommodate a short-term bed hold for a private patient? Nothing unusual. Hospitals did this for insurance reasons. It was documented correctly. It was fine. Then it was a larger favor. And another. By the time Aldridge understood the shape of what she was inside it far enough that understanding the shape didn't offer a way out. It offered leverage. And Price, who was methodical in the way that people who plan long-term operations were methodical, had been collecting leverage since the first favor. The 2 patients, Mara said, the ones who died. Aldridge's hands tightened slightly on the table. I was told they were operations, necessary operations. She looked at the table. I was told the patients were threats to national security. You were told that by Price? Yes. And you believed it? A pause. I needed to believe it, Aldridge said again. Same words as before. She seemed aware of the repetition. Price reports to Voss, Mara said, directly. I didn't know Voss's name until this morning, Aldridge said. Price never used it. He referred to his client as the principal. But you knew there was a principal. I knew there was someone above Price. Aldridge looked up. And I knew that whatever the network was, It was large enough that Price wasn't worried about exposure. He wasn't careful the way worried people are careful. He was careful the way people are careful when they believe they're protected. Mara sat with that for a moment. Protected. A man who operated with the confidence of someone who had, at some level, control over the mechanisms that would normally threaten him. The 3 hospitals, Mara said. Grants Pass, Bend, Eugene. What's the harvest protocol? Aldridge blinked. The word I sent. What does it activate? Asset extraction, Aldridge said. At each site, there are physical assets, records, financial documentation, communication logs that have been maintained on site because they're too sensitive to store digitally. The harvest protocol activates the on-site contacts to package and remove those assets, she paused. And it activates the patient protocols. Sinclair leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Meaning, at each site there are 1 or 2 patients whose presence at the facility is part of the network's operations, not ordinary patients. Aldridge's voice was even, but the effort of making it even was visible. People being held under constructed medical identities. If the harvest protocol is activated, those individuals are moved, transferred to facilities that don't officially exist. The room was quiet. Mara looked at Sinclair. How many people? Sinclair said. At the 3 sites, I was aware of 4 total, Aldridge said, but I only had visibility into Hargrove General's operations directly. The other sites, I received reports through Price. The actual numbers could be different. 4 people being held in hospitals under false identities. 4 people who, as of this afternoon, were being packaged for extraction to locations that wouldn't appear on any official record. We need to move on all 3 sites simultaneously, Mara said. Right now, not tonight, now. We don't have, Sinclair began. If we wait for the teams to fully position, the assets are gone and the patients go with them, Mara said. You need to call Portland and tell them to move with whatever they have. She kept her voice level. Price's people are already in motion. Every hour we sit in this room is an hour the extraction gets closer to finished. Sinclair looked at her. Then she stood and walked to the corner of the room and made a call. Mara looked at Aldridge. Warren Price, she said. Where is he right now? I don't know, Aldridge said. He contacts me. I've never had a direct way to reach him. When was your last contact? Yesterday morning, before... She gestured vaguely toward the events of the previous 20 hours. He told me you'd been suspended. He sounded satisfied. Mara thought about that. Price. Satisfied that she'd been removed from clinical rotation. Not knowing, not yet, that she'd go back in. Not knowing about the bathroom, the courier, the scrambler, the transport van. Not knowing any of it until it was already done. He doesn't know how last night ended, Mara said. Aldridge looked at her. What? He doesn't know his people failed. He sent the harvest protocol because you went dark, because your arrest triggered it automatically. But he doesn't know the specifics of what happened at Hargrove General. Mara looked at the table, turning it over. He thinks the operation is compromised but intact. He's extracting because it's the protocol, not because he knows the full extent of the exposure. She stood. Sinclair ended her call and turned around. Portland is moving. All 3 sites, whatever they have in position. She looked at Mara. What? Price doesn't know what we have, Mara said. He activated the harvest because Aldridge went dark. It's an automatic protocol, not an informed decision, which means he may not have moved yet himself. She looked at Sinclair. We've been running behind him all day, but if he's operating on incomplete information, he's running blind, Sinclair said. He's running on protocol, Mara said, which is different. Protocol tells you what to do. It doesn't tell you when the situation has changed. She paused. Where would Price go? If his network activates extraction, where does he go? Sinclair looked at Aldridge. Aldridge thought for a moment. He mentioned Seattle once. He had an apartment there. She shook her head. But he also... She stopped. What? Mara said. He mentioned once that the principal had a facility in the Cascades. She looked uncertain. I don't know if that's meaningful. It was said in passing. He was talking about a meeting he'd had. A facility in the Cascades, Mara said. Medical? Operational? I don't know, Aldridge said. He didn't explain it, and I didn't ask. I'd learned not to ask certain questions. Mara looked at Sinclair. That's. The drive back to Denton Falls took 20 minutes, and Mara spent it in the passenger seat of Reyes's vehicle, with her splinted arm in her lap and her phone running the Meridian Access Solutions documentation that Sinclair had forwarded, the full contract list, the 14 hospitals, the network of access credentials that had allowed a single MasterCard to pass through 14 facilities without logging. She was looking for a pattern, not in the hospitals themselves. She already understood the logic of the network, the way regional hospitals in mid-sized cities were selected for their combination of accessibility, reduced federal oversight, and chronic resource constraints that made administrators vulnerable to the kind of arrangement Price had offered Aldridge. That pattern was clear. She was looking for something else. The contract dates. The sequence in which Meridian had established access at each facility. She found it at the 7th hospital on the list, a facility in Medford, contracted 18 months before any of the others. Not regional, not mid-sized. A private specialty facility, the kind that dealt with long-term care, that had lower patient turnover and less scrutiny on admission processes. The kind of place where someone held under a constructed medical identity might stay for months without anyone looking closely. She looked at the facility name, Cascade Ridge Medical Center, Medford, Oregon. Cascade Ridge. The principal had a facility in the Cascades. She called Sinclair. Cascade Ridge Medical Center in Medford, she said, when Sinclair answered. It's the oldest contract in Meridian's portfolio, predates all the others by 18 months. She paused. It's not a regional hospital. It's a private long-term care facility. Silence on the line. That's not in our 7 confirmed operational sites, Sinclair said. No, Mara said. It's not. Because it's not being used the same way. She looked out the window at the dark highway, the tree line moving past. The other hospitals are transit points, access and cover. Cascade Ridge is a destination. Another silence. I need an address for the facility, Sinclair said. Mara was already pulling it up. She read it out. Don't move on it until I give the signal, Sinclair said. We need to coordinate with the Portland teams. If we hit Cascade Ridge before the 3 sites are secured, Price gets a warning and the Cascades facility goes dark. Understood, Mara said. She set the phone down. Reyes had been listening without comment. He drove in silence for another mile and then said, without taking his eyes off the road, the 4th patient. Pardon? Mara said. Aldridge said 4 patients across the 3 sites. Grants Pass, Bend, Eugene. He paused. 3 sites, 4 patients. 1 site has 2. Yes, Mara said. But Cascade Ridge isn't in that count, he said. That's a separate facility. Whatever's there isn't in Aldridge's accounting, Mara said. They drove. How many people do you think are in that building? Reyes asked. It was a question with several layers, and they both knew it. How many held under false identities? How many staff who were part of the network? How many who were simply doing their jobs without knowing what the facility was being used for? I don't know, Mara said honestly. The Portland field office coordinated simultaneous entries at all 3 hospitals at 9:14 p.m. Mara was not at any of them. She was at a conference table in the Denton Falls field office, which had become the operational center for the night, by virtue of being the location with the most assembled intelligence, watching a feed from each of the 3 sites on a monitor that Sinclair's technical agent had set up against the wall. The Grants Pass entry took 4 minutes. 2 individuals were taken into custody. 1 facility administrator, 1 nursing staff member. A cache of physical documents was found in a locked storage room behind the radiology department. Ledgers, communication records, financial documentation showing transfers through shell accounts over a period of 31 months. 2 patients whose admission records turned out to be fabricated were transferred to federal medical custody. Both were alive. The Bend entry was harder. The on-site contact had apparently received some signal, not from Aldridge's message, which had been intercepted, but from something else, some secondary protocol that Sinclair's people hadn't mapped. By the time the team moved, the physical assets at that site had been partially destroyed. Shredded documents, a wiped hard drive. 2 agents were also forced to restrain a second individual who attempted to leave the facility through a maintenance exit carrying a bag that turned out to contain the unshredded portion of the financial records. He was arrested in the parking lot. The patient at the Bend facility one, not two, was found in a room registered under a name that didn't match any identification system in any database. She was a woman in her late 40s, and when the agents told her who they were, she asked for water and then asked if she could use a phone. She'd been in that room for 7 months. The Eugene entry was clean. One patient, physical assets intact, administrator in custody before she'd had time to implement the destruction protocol. The documents there extended the financial trail back an additional 14 months, far enough that Sinclair's financial analysts, who were running numbers in real time, started seeing names that connected to defense contract allocations that had been audited and cleared 2 years ago. Audited, Mara understood, by people who had apparently been motivated to clear them. At 10:47 p.m., all 3 sites were secured. At 10:52 p.m., Sinclair gave the signal for Cascade Ridge. Mara was in the vehicle this time. She shouldn't have been. Sinclair hadn't offered, and she hadn't been invited. She'd simply been standing at the door when the team moved and had moved with them, and Sinclair had looked at her for exactly 1 second and not said no. The drive to Medford was 2 hours. She spent it in the back seat of a federal vehicle with Reyes, the splint on her arm resting on the door panel, watching the Oregon dark move past the window. The Cascade Mountain Range was invisible in the darkness, but she could feel it the way you felt large things in the dark, by the way the light ended abruptly on the horizon. They arrived at Cascade Ridge Medical Center at 1:03 a.m. The facility was smaller than she'd expected, a low-slung complex behind a wrought iron fence surrounded by Douglas firs, with a reception building at the front and 4 residential wings extending back. Professional landscaping, understated signage, the kind of place that communicated private wealth without advertising it. The main gate was unlocked, which was wrong. Sinclair noted it without comment. She signaled the team to split, 2 vehicles to the main entrance, 1 to each wing access point, 1 staying at the gate. They went in quiet, lights down. The reception building was empty. Not abandoned, says. The monitors at the nursing station were still running, a half-finished cup of coffee was on the desk, a coat was hanging behind the door. Recently vacated. Recently, as in minutes. Someone called it in, Reyes said quietly. Or someone was watching the road, Sinclair said. They moved to the residential wings. 3 of the 4 wings were occupied. Actual patients, actual long-term care residents, the kind of people who had legitimate reasons to be in a private care facility and had no idea what the institution had been used for. Night nurses on duty, confused by the arrival of federal agents, asking for identification and getting it. The 4th wing was locked from the inside. Not a standard lock. A magnetic locking system that required an override code, the kind used in psychiatric facilities or secure medical units, legitimate in some contexts, unusual in a general long-term care setting. The MasterCard from Mara's apartment, still in its evidence bag, was in Sinclair's jacket pocket. Sinclair looked at Mara. Mara looked at the card reader. It's already been processed as evidence, Sinclair said. Anything we do with it tonight goes to chain of custody questions. He left it in my apartment, Mara said. He wanted me to use it. Why? She thought about the message. There are 3 more. You're already late. Not a threat. Not really. A direction. Voss had known they'd find the 3 hospitals. The Harvest Protocol would make that inevitable. He'd wanted them running toward those 3 while he managed something here. Or he'd wanted them to find this. To see this. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Sinclair used the card. The lock disengaged. The wing was quiet. 6 rooms, 3 on each side, with a nursing station at the end that was dark. 5 of the 6 rooms were empty. Beds made, rooms clean, no personal effects, the specific blankness of space that had been cleared in a hurry. The 6th room was occupied. The man in the bed was old, mid-70s, thin, the particular frailty of someone who had been in a bed for a long time. He was awake when they entered, which suggested he'd heard the commotion in the corridor, and he looked at them with the clarity of someone whose mind was intact, even if his body wasn't. There was no name on the door, no chart visible. Who are you? Sinclair asked him, gently, direct. He looked at her, then he looked at Mara. His eyes stayed on Mara. You're the one from the hospital, he said. His voice was thin but steady. Denton Falls. Mara went very still. He said you'd come, the man said. Who said? Sinclair asked. The man looked at Sinclair as if she'd asked a question with an obvious answer. Voss? He said. The room was quiet. Harlan Voss told you we'd come here, Sinclair said. He told me the woman from the hospital would come, the man said. He said to give her the briefcase. He pointed. Under the bed. A dark briefcase, hard shell, the kind that locked. Mara crouched. Her knee complained. Her forearm complained. She ignored both and pulled it out. The lock combination was 4 digits. She looked at the briefcase. She looked at the man in the bed. Who are you? She asked. He held her gaze. I was Warren Price's supervisor, he said, before Price became what he became. He paused. Before I became what I became. You're not Harlan Voss, Sinclair said. No. He looked at the window. Harlan Voss has been dead for 3 years, he said. The man you've been looking for has been using that name since he took over the network. He turned back to Mara. The briefcase has the documentation, his real name, his location as of 48 hours ago. He looked at his hands. I've been in this room for 11 months. He put me here when I told him I wanted out. The room processed this in silence. Harlan Voss, the name, the identity they'd been tracking, was a constructed persona, a dead man's credentials used by someone who had taken over an existing network and built it into something larger, something that had embedded itself in 14 hospitals across the Pacific Northwest using a dead man's name as cover, which meant the classified file Mara had encountered 11 years ago, the name attached to a financial network running through defense contracts, had been legitimate. The original Harlan Voss had been real. The man using that name now was someone else entirely. Someone Greer had spent 14 months getting close to. Someone whose real name was in the briefcase under the bed. The combination, Mara said to the man in the bed. He looked at her. 4 digits, he said, the year the network was founded. I don't know when that was, Mara said. No, he said, but Thomas Greer does. He paused. That's why the briefcase was left for you and not for them. He nodded toward Sinclair. He said you'd find Greer. He said Greer would tell you. Why does it matter who opens it? Sinclair said, with the controlled frustration of a woman who had been moving through a long night on insufficient information and was now being asked to solve a puzzle. Because the contents are addressed to someone specific, the man said. And if that person isn't the one who opens it, the documentation inside will, I was told, become complicated to use. He looked at his hands again. I don't know all the mechanics of it, he said. I was told to give the briefcase to the woman from the hospital and to tell her that Greer has the combination. He paused. And to tell her that the man she's looking for is not running. He never runs. He's waiting. Waiting where? Mara said. The man looked at the window. Outside, the Cascade firs were black against a dark sky, the entire world compressed to the small radius of the facility's exterior lights. He said you'd know, the man said, when you open the briefcase. Mara looked at the briefcase. She looked at Sinclair. She thought about Greer in his secure facility with his chest tube scar and his 14 months of documentation and the combination that unlocked something that was apparently addressed to her specifically, set up by a man who had broken into her apartment while she slept and left her a key card and a message, who had positioned all of this with the patience and precision of someone who had been thinking several moves ahead for longer than any of them had been paying attention. Not running, waiting. She stood up, her knee and forearm making their objections known, and she held the briefcase. I need to talk to Greer, she said. Sinclair was already on her phone. And somewhere in the dark outside the facility, somewhere in the Cascade Mountains or the city below them, or the arterial network of roads that connected all of it, the man who was not Harlan Voss was waiting in the way that people waited when they believed they had already won, with the particular stillness of someone who had decided that the outcome was settled and was simply letting it arrive. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. Greer picked up on the second ring. Mara hadn't expected that. It was nearly 2 a.m, and she'd assumed she'd be working through whoever was managing his secure facility, navigating access protocols and hold times. But his voice came through immediately, alert in the specific way of someone who had not been sleeping. The briefcase, he said before she could speak. You knew about it, she said. I knew he'd built a contingency. I didn't know the shape of it until right now. A pause. She could hear him moving, the shift of someone sitting up in a bed or a chair. Where are you? Cascade Ridge Medical Center, Medford. She looked at the briefcase on the table in front of her, the hard shell of it, the lock with its 4 blank digits waiting. There's a man here. Says he was Price's supervisor before the network changed hands. He says you have the combination. Silence. The year, Greer said. He built it around the year the original network was founded. Before Voss, before the real Voss, before any of us were paying attention. Another pause. 1991. She dialed the combination. The locks released. Inside the briefcase, organized with the precision of a man who had been preparing this for some time, were 3 things: a bound set of documents, a hard drive in a padded case, and a single sealed envelope with her name on it. Not Warden. Her name. Mara Voss. Written in the same small, neat handwriting as the message in her apartment. She looked at it. The real name, she said to Greer. The man using Voss's identity. It's in here? It should be, he said. Everything I couldn't transmit, everything too sensitive to trust to any digital channel. He built that as the physical record, the last insurance policy. A pause. Who put it there? Who arranged it? A man in a bed in a locked wing, she said. He says he's been here 11 months. A longer pause. Raymond Kells, Greer said, Price's original handler before the takeover. He didn't give a name. He wouldn't, but if he's there, and if the briefcase is there… Greer stopped. She could hear him working something through. Kells has been trying to get out of the network for 2 years. He contacted us once, 18 months ago, through a cutout that burned before we could establish communication. We thought he was dead. He paused again. He's not running a play for Voss. He's running a play against him. He's been sitting in that room waiting for someone to come through the door. Why me specifically? She said. Because Voss made you visible, Greer said. He accessed your file. He broke into your apartment. He put you in the center of it. A pause. Kells knew that whoever Voss chose to make a point of, that person was going to be the one who followed it to the end. He picked the right person to aim the arrow at. She looked at the envelope with her name on it. Open it, Greer said. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper. At the top, a photograph, printed in black and white, slightly grainy, the kind of image taken from a surveillance source. A man in his early 60s, broad-faced, with the kind of physical solidity that didn't come from a gym. Below the photograph, a name she didn't recognize. Below the name, an address. Not a facility, not an office, a private residence. 31 miles north of Medford. And below the address, in Kells's small handwriting, he's been there since yesterday morning. He hasn't left. He thinks the Harvest Protocol bought him time. It didn't. She handed the sheet to Sinclair without a word. Sinclair looked at it, looked at the address, looked at Mara. I need to call this in, Sinclair said. Do it fast, Mara said. Peace. She didn't go to the address. That was Sinclair's operation. Federal agents, coordinated entry, the infrastructure of an arrest that would need to hold up through years of prosecution. Mara understood this and accepted it, because there was a difference between being part of something and being the instrument of every part of it. And the thing she'd been most useful for across the last 48 hours was the piece that didn't require a badge or a warrant. She sat with Raymond Kells instead. He was still in the bed. He'd apparently decided there was nowhere to go, which was either resignation or relief. She couldn't tell which, and she pulled the chair from the corner of the room and sat at his bedside. And they talked in the particular quiet of 3 a.m, when the building around them was full of activity and their room was briefly still. He was not a good man. She was clear-eyed about that, and she thought he was too. The network he'd helped build had hurt people in ways that wouldn't be fully accounted for even after the prosecutions were finished. The 2 patients at Hargrove General who'd been logged as natural deaths. The woman in Bend who'd spent 7 months in a room under a name that wasn't hers. All the other people she didn't know about yet, the ones the investigators would spend months uncovering. Kells had been part of building the infrastructure that made all of that possible, even if he'd drawn a line eventually, even if the line had come too late. She didn't say any of that to him. She didn't need to. The man using Voss's name, she said. How long has he been running the network? 3 years and 8 months, Kells said. He came in as a financial partner, investment in Northwest Health Strategies. Legitimate capital, initially. He looked at the ceiling. When the real Voss died, cardiac event, nothing dramatic, just a man's heart stopping, he moved into the operational role within 6 weeks. He'd been positioned for it. I think he was positioned for it before Voss died. A pause. I think he may have assisted the positioning. Assisted the cardiac event, Mara said. Kells didn't answer, which was an answer. Why did you want out? She asked. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer. There was a patient, he said, at one of the transit hospitals. She wasn't part of any operation. She was just a woman who was in the wrong room at the wrong time, who overheard something she shouldn't have overheard, and the decision was made to manage the situation. He looked at his hands. She had 2 children. I found that out after. He paused. I don't know why that was the thing, after everything else, but it was. Mara sat with that. She understood the mechanism of it, the way people in corrupt systems sustain their participation through compartmentalization, through the comfortable abstraction of operations and protocols in managed situations, until one specific face or one specific detail cracked the abstraction open and made everything real. She didn't excuse it. She also recognized it as human, which was a different thing. The children, she said. They had a grandmother who took them in, he said. I made sure of that, anonymously. It was the only thing I could do that didn't... He stopped. It wasn't enough. I know that. No, she said. It wasn't. He nodded. He'd expected her to say that. The briefcase, she said. How long were you planning to hand it to someone? Since last winter, he said, when I understood that Greer was getting close. I didn't know his name then. I knew there was a federal operative inside the network's surveillance range, and I knew it was a matter of time. He looked at her. I also knew that when the moment came, the man who's been running this operation wouldn't exit quietly. He'd burn everything he could reach on the way out. He tried, Mara said. Did he succeed? She thought about the Ben facility, the shredded documents, the wiped drive, the unshredded portion recovered in the parking lot. She thought about the simultaneous entries at all 3 sites, the patients transferred to federal custody, the financial trail that Sinclair's analysts were still unspooling. No, she said. Kells closed his eyes. Not relief, exactly. Something closer to the end of a long and specific tension, the kind that had been held in place for months and had no further reason to exist. Good, he said. The arrest happened at 4:47 a.m. Sinclair called Mara from the scene, 31 miles north, a private property at the end of a Forest Service road, a house that was comfortable without being conspicuous, the kind of place a man maintained when he needed a location that didn't appear in any professional record. He had been there. He had not run. He had been sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and a phone he hadn't used, and a demeanor that struck Sinclair's team, she said, as almost theatrical in its calm, like a man who had decided on a posture and held it. He'd asked for his lawyer before anyone finished reading him his rights. He'd said nothing else. He had a bag packed, Sinclair said, near the back door. He was going to run. He'd just waited too long. The Harvest Protocol gave him a false timeline, Mara said. He thought the 3 hospitals would buy him another 12 hours. They bought him 6, Sinclair said, and you moved up the Cascade Ridge entry. A pause. I'll want to debrief fully in the morning or this morning. Later this morning. I'll be there, Mara said. She sat in the chair in Raymond Kells's room in the locked wing of Cascade Ridge Medical Center, and she listened to the facility coming back to careful life around her. Voices in the corridor, agents moving through other parts of the building, the sound of documentation beginning, which was what everything eventually became. Paper, records, the slow institutional accounting of what had happened. Through the window, the sky was beginning to change. Not light yet. The earliest possible suggestion of it, the darkness thinning at its own edges. She was very tired. Her arm hurt. Her knee hurt. The bruise on her forearm from the courier's block had purpled overnight to the specific color of deep tissue damage that would take 2 weeks to fade. She sat in the chair and let herself be tired for a while. Because there was no one to perform steadiness for and no immediate reason to move, and she'd been in motion for the better part of 2 days, and the stillness felt like something she'd earned. The debrief lasted 4 hours. She drove back to Denton Falls in daylight, the Rogue Valley giving way to the Umpqua, and then the Cascades on the other side. The landscape running green and dry and green again, in the way of Oregon in summer. She drove with the windows down and the radio off, and she thought about almost nothing, which was a skill she'd developed a long time ago and hadn't needed in 7 years and found still available, like a language you'd stopped speaking that came back to the tongue when required. At home, she slept for 9 hours without interruption. The formal review process took 11 days. She'd known it would take time. Institutions moved at institutional pace regardless of the stakes that had surrounded the original action. But she'd also known from the morning Sinclair left her apartment that the outcome was not genuinely in question. The withdrawal of Cass's complaint, filed the same day he'd called her, had started the administrative process of unwinding the suspension. The federal involvement in the Hargrove General investigation had accelerated it. By the 4th day, the hospital's legal team was communicating with her directly, which was how you knew the institutional position had shifted from defensive to corrective. She waited. She went to orthopedics and had her wrist properly evaluated. Non-displaced radial fracture. The urgent care physician had been correct. And she sat in a waiting room with a magazine she didn't read and thought about the woman in the Bend facility who had spent 7 months in a room under a name that wasn't hers, and what that woman's 11 days of waiting looked like compared to her own. She called Sinclair on the 5th day to ask about the Bend patient. Her name was Lorraine Tabor. 51 years old, a former financial analyst who had been working as a contracted auditor for a defense industry firm when she'd flagged anomalies in a set of accounts that connected, as far as Lorraine had been able to trace at the time, to a shell company she couldn't identify. She'd reported the anomalies to her supervisor. 2 weeks later, she'd been in the Bend facility under a constructed identity and a fabricated psychiatric history. She was with her family now. She was going to be a witness. Mara sat with that information for a while. Then she got up and went back to work on the things she could move forward. The statement she was preparing for the federal case, the detailed accounting of everything she'd observed over the previous 48 hours, the specific clinical documentation of the 2 attempts on Greer's life in the hospital that would become part of the evidentiary record. She wrote it all out carefully. She was precise about the medical details. She was precise about the tactical details. She did not editorialize. She let the facts carry the weight, because they were heavy enough. Greer came to Denton Falls on the 9th day. He'd been cleared for travel by his surgical team. The left lung was healing cleanly. The chest tube scar was closing. And he showed up at her apartment building on a Tuesday afternoon with a slight favoring of his left side that she recognized as a man managing pain. He wasn't going to acknowledge, and a messenger bag over his right shoulder. She buzzed him up. He looked around her apartment with the particular attention of someone who had spent most of his professional life reading rooms, and then he sat in the chair, the one she'd been sitting in when she'd found the message in her closet, which felt like something that had happened several months ago and had in fact been 9 days. And he looked at her. "How's the arm?" he said. "Fractured," she said. "Non-displaced. Better than it could have been." Yes. They sat in the ordinary silence of 2 people who didn't need to fill space, which was its own kind of specific recognition. The acknowledgement that the other person was accustomed to silence and wasn't threatened by it. "Sinclair told me what you did," he said. "All of it. Not just the things she knew about while they were happening." "She told you about the records rooms." "She told me about all of it," he said. "The server logs, the fire panel, tests, the courier." He looked at her steadily. "You were supposed to go home." "I know," she said. "I'm not criticizing," he said. "I'm aware I'm the last person who can criticize your choices in this particular situation." He paused. "I'm saying I'm aware of what it cost. The arm, the other injuries, the 7 years you spent building a life that didn't—" "The life is still there," she said. He looked at her. "It wasn't destroyed," she said. "I thought it might be. The first morning when I drove home after everything, I thought about what I'd lost. And then I went inside and the apartment was exactly the same, and the plants were still alive and the coffee was still in the same place in the cabinet." She looked at the window. The life was still there. It just had more context now. Greer was quiet for a moment. What kind of context? She thought about it honestly, the way she'd gotten better at doing. I spent 7 years believing that the distance I'd put between myself and what I used to do was what kept me stable, she said. Like, the distance itself was the medicine. She paused, but I think I was mostly just in suspension. Not healed, not broken. Just paused. She looked at her splinted arm. The last 2 days, that wasn't damage. That was... She stopped, because the word that came to mind was familiar. And it was accurate, but it was also complicated, because she had enough self-awareness to know that finding something familiar didn't automatically make it right. You don't have to decide what it means yet, Greer said. No, she agreed. He reached into the messenger bag, pulled out a folder, set it on the coffee table between them without opening it. Sinclair asked me to bring this, he said. She thought it would be better coming from me. He looked at the folder. It's a formal offer. There's a unit being assembled. Federal, small, operates at the intersection of medical infrastructure and national security. The Cascade Ridge situation made visible a gap that nobody had wanted to look at directly. He paused. They need people who understand both sides of it, the clinical and the operational. She looked at the folder. I'm a nurse, she said. You were a major, he said. Both, she said. I'm both. Yes, he said. That's why the offer exists. He paused. It's not a return to what you were. It's something different. The unit is built around the idea that the people most likely to identify threats inside medical infrastructure are the people who actually understand medical infrastructure. He looked at her steadily. People who know what a hemothorax looks like, who know which door has been propped open for 8 months, who know to listen to the fire panel intercom. She looked at the folder. She thought about the morning she'd walked into Hargrove General's ER and seen a man on a stretcher that nobody else was watching, and the 4 seconds it had taken to understand that something was wrong, and how 7 years of nursing had made those 4 seconds possible as much as 11 years of military service had. She thought about Petra, who had invented Protocol 14 in real time and then enforced it without being asked again. She thought about Lorraine Tabor, who had flagged anomalies in a set of accounts and had spent 7 months in a room because of it. She thought about the way institutions worked, the way they absorbed people who understood the gaps and the shortcuts and the propped open doors, and the way that knowledge was invisible until it suddenly wasn't. She picked up the folder. She opened it. Bokit. The formal restoration of her administrative standing at Hargrove General was completed on the 11th day. She received the notification by email. A single paragraph from the Human Resources Department, clinical and brief, informing her that the suspension had been lifted and all disciplinary notations removed from her file, and that she was welcome to contact scheduling to arrange her return to rotation. She sat with the email for a few minutes. Then she drove to the hospital. She hadn't been in the building since the morning she'd walked back out through the automatic doors after Reyes had said thank you in the loading bay, which felt like it belonged to a different chapter of something. The front entrance looked the same. The lobby looked the same. The nursing station on the 4th floor looked the same. And the smell was the same. Antiseptic and recycled air. And Petra was at the station, because Petra was always at the station when the shift aligned. And she looked up when Mara came through. You're back, Petra said. For a visit, Mara said. I wanted to talk to you. Petra looked at her with the composed attention of a woman who had spent 20 years reading situations and people. Is this about Protocol 14? It's about the job you did, Mara said. All of it, the whole night. You held the ward. Petra was quiet for a moment. I enforced a protocol I invented on the spot, she said, based on the word of a suspended nurse. Yes, Mara said. Which either makes me flexible or reckless, Petra said. I haven't fully decided. It makes you someone who trusted her own read of the situation, Mara said. Under pressure. That's not small. Petra looked at her for a long moment. Are you coming back to the floor? I don't think so, Mara said. I have something else I need to do. The federal thing, Petra said. It wasn't a question. Mara looked at her. How do you know about that? I don't, Petra said. I know that what happened here last week doesn't produce offers of floor nursing. She held Mara's gaze. I hope it's good work. I think it will be, Mara said. She walked to the elevator. She rode it to the 2nd floor. She went to find Elliot Cass. His office was the kind of office that told you something about the person. Medical textbooks shelved by specialty. 2 journals open on the desk. A photograph of what looked like a family ski trip tucked in the frame of his monitor in the way of someone who had put it there long enough ago that he'd stopped seeing it. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and his face did the thing it had been doing every time he saw her since the night in the lobby. A particular alertness, a recalibration that hadn't finished resolving itself. "Mara," he said. "I'm not coming back to the floor," she said from the doorway. She figured that was the thing he most needed to know, and that leading with it was more respectful than making him ask. He absorbed that. "All right. I wanted to tell you directly," she said. "Not through HR." He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something and was determining whether it was the accurate thing or just the comfortable thing, which she'd realized was a habit of his. The same precision he applied to clinical decisions, applied more slowly and less comfortably to everything else. "The 4 years," he said, that you were here. I treated you. I was consistently—" He stopped. Started again. "I dismissed what you knew, consistently, and I told myself it was about protocol, about hierarchy, about the appropriate structure of clinical decision-making." He looked at the desk. "But if I'm being honest, which I'm apparently doing, it was more personal than that. You were better at reading certain patients than I was, and instead of—" He stopped again. "You didn't have to come to terms with it," she said. "That's what the hierarchy is for. It makes the deference feel structural instead of personal." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted in a way that suggested she'd named something accurately. "I filed the withdrawal the same day you told me to," he said. "I know," she said. "For what it's worth something," she said. "It's not everything, but it's not nothing." She said it without heat. She meant it in both directions. He nodded. She turned to go. "Mara." He said it before he seemed to have decided to, and then he went ahead anyway. "Whatever you're doing next, I hope it's something you chose." She thought about the folder on her coffee table and the offer it contained, and the fact that she'd read it twice and was going to say yes, not because she felt obligated, and not because she'd been maneuvered into it by the events of the last week, but because she'd sat with it honestly for 2 days and found that it was something she wanted, that the wanting was real. "It is," she said. She walked back to the elevator. On the way through the lobby, she passed the overflow area. The chairs and the low tables and the numbered queue display, the particular afternoon crowd of a regional hospital on a weekday, people waiting for results and referrals, and the ongoing management of bodies that required maintenance. She slowed without fully stopping. She thought about a man on a stretcher that nobody was watching. She thought about 4 seconds and what you did with them. The court proceedings began 6 weeks later. The man who had operated under the name Mara Voss, his real name was Martin Colby, which was somehow both more and less remarkable than the name he'd borrowed, was arraigned on federal charges that included conspiracy, fraud, unlawful detention, and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. The murder charges corresponded to the 2 patients at Hargrove General, whose deaths had been logged as natural. Mara testified. She testified in a federal courtroom on a Wednesday in October, in a charcoal blazer and with her wrist out of the splint and a bruise long since faded from her forearm, and she answered questions with the same precision she'd used to write her statement. Clinical where clinical was required, tactical where that was required, and when the prosecutor asked her to describe the moment she'd recognized that the man in the overflow stretcher's injuries were inconsistent with a vehicle accident, she described it in exactly the detail that a jury of people who had never thought about hemothorax patterns or tactical wound signatures could follow. She didn't simplify it into a story. She explained it as a process. The jury followed it. She looked at Martin Colby once, across the courtroom. He had the same physical solidity as the photograph in the briefcase. He looked back at her without expression, with the particular blankness of a man who had decided that his face was the last thing he could control and was controlling it. She looked away. She didn't need anything from his face. Catherine Aldridge pled guilty to conspiracy charges and agreed to cooperate fully with the federal prosecution. She received a reduced sentence, 8 years, eligible for parole consideration at 5, which was the arithmetic of cooperation and the legal accounting of someone who had been a node rather than an architect. Mara didn't object to the arrangement. She understood the mechanics of prosecution well enough to know that Aldridge's testimony was a working part of the case against Colby, and that the case against Colby was the point. Tanya Briggs pled to a lesser charge, obstruction, failure to report, and received 18 months. Douglas Farwell's lawyer argued for a similar arrangement, but Farwell had been the one who manipulated the server logs that covered the access patterns preceding the 2 patient deaths, and the federal judge was not interested in the argument. He received 6 years. Warren Price was arrested in Vancouver, British Columbia, 4 weeks after Colby's arrest. He'd made it across the border on a constructed identity that held for 26 days before a customs database flag caught it. He was extradited and charged separately. Raymond Kells cooperated with federal investigators from his room at Cascade Ridge, which he continued to occupy on a voluntary basis while his medical situation was evaluated and his legal status was worked out. He was old and sick and had been imprisoned for 11 months by a man he'd helped create, and the federal prosecutor's calculus on Kells was long and complicated in ways that Mara didn't have visibility into. She knew he was alive. She knew he was talking. That was enough for now. The woman in Bend, Lorraine Tabor, testified in a separate civil proceeding that was moving parallel to the criminal case. Mara read coverage of it in the way she read coverage of everything connected to the case. Carefully. Once, and then set aside. She couldn't fix what had happened to Lorraine Tabor. She could make sure the thing that happened to Lorraine Tabor had its full accounting, and she'd done that through her testimony, and that was what she had to offer. The financial forensics took the longest. The shell companies, the defense contract allocations, the payments to Aldridge and Farwell and Briggs, and the network's on-site contacts at each of the 7 operational hospitals. All of it had to be traced and documented and connected in ways that would hold through years of legal challenge. Sinclair's financial analysts worked on it for months. The final recovered sum, as reported in the federal filing, was $67 million. The actual amount that had moved through the network over the years of its operation was, the filing noted, likely larger and not fully recoverable. $67 million. Built on access to 14 hospitals. Built on the specific institutional blind spots that allowed people in administrative authority to make choices that nobody with clinical knowledge was positioned to question, because the 2 worlds, administrative and clinical, ran in parallel and barely intersected unless someone forced the intersection. Mara thought about that. She thought about it in the context of the offer in the folder, and in the context of Lorraine Tabor, and in the context of the 2 patients at Hargrove General whose families had been told that their person had died of medical complications. She thought about what it would mean to close that gap. Not completely. Nothing closed completely. That was the other lie institutions told, that there were solutions rather than ongoing, effortful work, but consistently, attentively, with the specific kind of attention that came from understanding both sides of the wall. She said yes to the offer. The unit didn't have a name yet. That was the first thing she learned when Sinclair walked her through the operational framework on a Tuesday in November, sitting across from each other at a table in a federal building in Portland while rain came down against the windows in the particular organ way that suggested it would continue indefinitely. The unit had a mandate, a staffing plan, a budget allocation, and an operational structure. It did not have a name, because the people above Sinclair's pay grade were still arguing about the classification level of its existence. Mara found this very normal. "You'd be leading the clinical integration component," Sinclair said. "Not the investigations themselves. There are people for that. You'd be building the framework for identifying medical infrastructure vulnerabilities before they're exploited." "Proactive," Mara said. "Ideally," Sinclair said, "with reactive capacity when it's required." "When it's required," Mara said, "meaning when something like Hargrove General happens." "Yes," Sinclair said. "Which will happen again," Mara said. "Yes," Sinclair said, "it will." Mara looked at the rain. She thought about the gap, the specific blind spot that had allowed a network to embed itself in 14 hospitals over years without being caught. She thought about the people who worked in those hospitals, the Petras and the night nurses and the overnight techs, who understood the physical geography of their buildings, the way residents understood neighborhoods, the propped open doors, the camera blind spots, the terminal in the administrative wing whose access code was the department extension. People who knew things without knowing that what they knew was useful. I want to build a reporting structure, she said, inside the participating facilities. Clinical staff, nurses primarily, but techs also, anyone who has sustained floor presence, who have a direct line to report anomalies without going through administrative channels. Sinclair looked at her. Because the administrative channel is where the corruption embeds, Mara said. Aldridge could suppress information from her own staff because she controlled the channel it moved through. A parallel structure creates its own vulnerabilities, Sinclair said. Everything creates vulnerabilities, Mara said. The question is which vulnerabilities you can manage and which ones you can't. She paused. I can manage the ones in a clinical reporting structure. I know what they look like. I know how they fail. I know because I've worked inside them for 7 years. Sinclair was quiet for a moment. Put it in writing, she said. I'll take it up the chain. I will, Mara said. She went home and wrote it up that evening at the small kitchen table with a cup of tea. She let go cold, the notes from the Cascade Ridge briefcase spread beside her laptop as reference, the rain still coming down outside. She wrote it as a proposal, structured, precise, with a clear argument for each component. And she was good at it, which didn't surprise her but did give her a specific satisfaction that was different from the satisfaction of clinical precision, more deliberate, more built. She finished at midnight, she read it back. She changed 3 things and left the rest. Thomas Greer was discharged from federal medical care on a Thursday in December. She knew because he called her from a number that was now regular rather than secured and told her he was driving north and would be in Denton Falls by evening if she was around. She was around. They had dinner at a restaurant 2 blocks from her apartment, a small Italian place that she'd been going to since her 2nd year in Denton Falls, where the booths were old and the lighting was dim and nobody cared how long you stayed. He'd recovered well. The left side favoring was almost gone. He looked like a man who had been through something significant and had made his peace with the physical evidence of it. They talked about the case, the parts that had resolved, and the parts that were still moving through the system, the testimony she'd given and the testimony he'd given, Colby's legal team's strategy, which was elaborate and would eventually fail. They talked about the unit, which Greer had been loosely consulted on as an advisor, the kind of advisory role that fit the particular expertise of a man who had spent 14 months embedded in exactly the kind of network the unit was designed to find. They talked about what came after, not abstractly, specifically. He was taking a desk position while his lung finished healing. He found this irritating, but had apparently been convinced by his surgical team that 48-year-old men with recent thoracic trauma had limits worth respecting. She told him about the proposal she'd submitted. The parallel reporting structure, he said. Yes. He looked at his pasta for a moment. You know the first person to use it will be someone reporting something minor, a medication discrepancy, a scheduling anomaly. Nothing connected to anything. Probably, she said. And the second person, he said. Also probably something minor, she said. And the third. Maybe the 30th. She looked at him. Until it isn't. He looked at her. Most of the time, nothing is wrong, she said. That's the nature of it. You build the structure for the moments when something is wrong, and you tolerate a lot of nothing in between. She paused. That's nursing too, actually. 90% of the work is maintenance. You do the maintenance so you're ready for the 10%. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you were always going to do something like this. I don't know about always, she said. I think you do, he said. I think the 7 years you spent in Hargrove General weren't a detour. I think you were learning something specific and you didn't know yet what you'd need it for. She thought about that honestly. She thought about the 14 months Greer had spent inside the network. About Kels's 11 months in the locked wing, about Lorraine Tabor's 7 months in Bend, about the 2 patients at Hargrove General whose time had simply run out, about the years the network had operated before anyone was positioned to find the thread. She thought about a man on a stretcher, and 4 seconds, and what you chose to do with them. Maybe, she said. He raised his glass. To the people nobody's watching, he said. She understood what he meant. The patients in the overflow beds, the ones who didn't code loudly enough to attract immediate attention, the ones who arrived without ID and died without explanation, The ones who spent months in rooms under names that weren't theirs while the institutional machinery moved around them without registering their presence. The ones who needed someone to notice. She raised her glass. "And to the people doing the watching," she said. In February, she stood in a federal conference room in Portland and presented the clinical integration framework to a room that included Sinclair, two senior officials whose specific roles she wasn't told, and a woman named Dr. Yolanda Marsh, who ran the CDC's Hospital Infrastructure Security Division and had flown in from Atlanta specifically for this meeting. Mara stood at the front of the room with a fractured wrist long since healed and a bruise long since faded, and 7 years of nursing knowledge and 11 years of military experience organized into a 20-minute presentation, and she talked about the gap. She talked about what the gap looked like from the inside, from the floor of a regional hospital, from the position of a nurse who understood the physical and administrative geography of a building in a way that nobody above a certain pay grade ever did. She talked about what a parallel reporting structure could do and what it couldn't do and how to tell the difference. She talked about the specific clinical signals that preceded what had happened at Hargrove General, the wrong discharge patterns, the implausible admission histories, the peculiar smoothness of records that had been managed rather than documented. And she talked about how to build a clinical eye for them into a system that had never been designed to see them. She was precise. She was clear. She did not perform certainty she didn't have. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Dr. Marsh said, "How long to implement at a pilot site?" 6 months to build and train, Mara said. Another 6 to evaluate. A year before I'd have data worth showing you. "And you'd be running it," Marsh said. "I'd be building it," Mara said. "Running it is a longer conversation." Marsh looked at the two officials. Something passed between them that wasn't quite visible to Mara, but had the quality of a decision being confirmed rather than made. "Then let's start the longer conversation," Marsh said. She drove back to Denton Falls through the Willamette Valley in the late afternoon, the winter light at the angle that turned the agricultural flatlands gold, the Cascades on the eastern horizon in the clear particular way of February when the air was cold enough to resolve the mountains into detail. She drove with the radio on, something with a lot of acoustic guitar, which was what the satellite station was playing and which she found she didn't mind, and she thought about the year ahead, the work that was waiting, the structures that didn't exist yet, the hospitals that didn't know they were vulnerable and the staff inside them who knew things they didn't know they knew. The gap that had let a network run for years and the possibility, not the certainty, the possibility, of closing it enough to matter. She thought about what she'd told Elliot Cass in the lobby. "I'm a nurse." She was still a nurse. She was also everything else she'd been before. And the woman who'd spent 7 years in Denton Falls, and the person who had walked down a corridor toward the quiet one when everyone else moved toward the noise. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was what the situation required, and she was the person in the building who could see it. There was something in that worth sitting with. She'd spent a long time believing that the distance between her lives, the military one and the civilian one, the classified one and the ordinary one, was a wound she'd been managing. She'd treated the distance like damage, kept things separated, kept the past behind its particular door, built the ordinary world around it carefully. She understood now that the distance had never been damage. It had been data. Every year of surgical field work, every year of nursing in an underfunded regional hospital, every protocol she'd memorized and every shortcut she'd learned and every morning she'd spent being dismissed by a man who couldn't see past her title to what she actually knew. All of it had been building something that didn't have a name until a man on a stretcher said a word that opened the door between her lives, and she'd walked through it and found that she was capable of standing in the space on the other side. Not because she was exceptional, because she'd paid attention, because she'd stayed when it would have been easier to go. Not to prove anything to anyone. Not for recognition, not for vindication, not for the specific satisfaction of being right in front of the people who'd dismissed her, though she was honest enough to admit that the satisfaction existed and was not nothing. She'd stayed because the person on the stretcher needed someone who could see what was happening to them. That was the whole of it. The radio played something she didn't know the name of, and the mountains held their position on the horizon, and she drove north through the valley while the light continued its February work of turning everything gold before the dark came in. She had things to build. She had time. She drove.